Life on the Mississippi by Mark Twain. Chapter 34. Tough Yarns. Stack Island. I remembered Stack Island. Also Lake Providence, Louisiana, which is the first distinctly southern-looking town you come to, downward bound, lies level and low, shade trees hung with venerable gray beards of Spanish moss, restful, pensive. Sunday aspect about the place, comments Uncle Mumford with feeling, also with truth. Mr. H. furnished some minor details of fact concerning this region, which I would have hesitated to believe if I had not known him to be a steamboat mate. He was a passenger of ours, a resident of Arkansas City, and bound to Vicksburg to join his boat, a little Sunflower packet. He was an austere man, and had the reputation of being singularly unworldly for a riverman. Among other things, he said that Arkansas had been injured and kept back by generations of exaggerations concerning the mosquitoes here. One may smile, said he, and turn the matter off as being a small thing, but when you come to look at the effects produced, in the way of discouragement of immigration and diminished values of property, it was quite the opposite of a small thing, or thing in any wise to be coughed down or sneered at. These mosquitoes had been persistently represented as being formidable and lawless, whereas the truth is they are feeble, insignificant in size, diffident to a fault, sensitive, and so on and so on. You would have supposed he was talking about his family. But if he was soft on the Arkansas mosquitoes, he was hard enough on the mosquitoes of Lake Providence to make up for it. Those Lake Providence colossi, as he finally called them, he said that 2 of them could whip a dog, and that 4 of them could hold a man down, and except help come, they would kill him, butcher him, as he expressed it. Referred in a sort of casual way, and yet significant way, to the fact that the life policy in its simplest form is unknown in Lake Providence. They take out a mosquito policy besides. He told many remarkable things about those lawless insects. Among others, said he had seen them try to vote. Noticing that this statement seemed to be a good deal of a strain on us, he modified it a little, said he might have been mistaken as to that particular, but knew he had seen them around the polls canvassing. There was another passenger, friend of H's, who backed up the harsh evidence against those mosquitoes, and detailed some stirring adventures which he had had with them. The stories were pretty sizable, merely pretty sizable. Yet Mr. H. was continually interrupting with a cold, inexorable, "Wait, knock off 25% of that, now go on," or "Wait, you are getting that too strong, cut it down, you get a leetle too much costumery onto your statements, always dress a fact in tights, never in an ulster," or "Pardon once more, if you are going to load anything more onto that statement, you want to get a couple of lighters and tow the rest, because it's drawing all the water there is in the river already. Stick to facts, just stick to the cold facts. What these gentlemen want for a book is the frozen truth, ain't that so, gentlemen?" He explained privately that it was necessary to watch this man all the time, and keep him within bounds. It would not do to neglect this precaution, as he, Mr. H., knew to his sorrow. Said he, "I will not deceive you. He told me such a monstrous lie once, that it swelled my left ear up, and spread it so that I was actually not able to see out around it. It remained so for months, and people came miles to see me fan myself with it." Chapter 35. Vicksburg during the Trouble. We used to plow past the lofty hill city Vicksburg downstream, but we cannot do that now. A cut-off has made a country town of it, like Osceola, St. Genevieve, and several others. There is currentless water, also a big island in front of Vicksburg now. You come down the river, the other side of the island, then turn and come up to the town, that is, in high water. In low water you can't come up, but must land some distance below it. Signs and scars still remain as reminders of Vicksburg's tremendous war experiences: earthworks, trees crippled by the cannon balls, cave refuges in the clay precipices, etc. The caves did good service during the 6 weeks' bombardment of the city, May 8th to July 4th, 1863. They were used by the non-combatants, mainly by the women and children, not to live in constantly, but to fly to for safety on occasion. They were mere holes, tunnels driven into the perpendicular clay bank, then branched Y-shape within the hill. Life in Vicksburg during the 6 weeks was but wait, here are some materials out of which to reproduce it. Population, 27,000 soldiers, 3,000 non-combatants. The city utterly cut off from the world, walled solidly in, the frontage by gunboats, the rear by soldiers and batteries. Hence, no buying and selling with the outside, no passing to and fro, no God-speeding a parting guest, no welcoming a coming one, no printed acres of world-wide news to be read at breakfast mornings, a tedious dull absence of such matter instead. Hence, also, no running to see steamboats smoking into view in the distance up or down, and plowing toward the town, for none came. The river lay vacant and undisturbed. No rush and turmoil around the railway station, no struggling over bewildered swarms of passengers by noisy mobs of hackmen. All quiet there. Flour $200 a barrel, sugar $30, corn $10 a bushel, bacon $5 a pound, rum $100 a gallon, other things in proportion. Consequently, no roar and racket of drays and carriages tearing along the streets. Nothing for them to do among that handful of non-combatants of exhausted means. At 3 o'clock in the morning, silence. Silence so dead that the measured tramp of a sentinel can be heard a seemingly impossible distance. Out of hearing of this lonely sound, perhaps the stillness is absolute. All in a moment come ground-shaking thunder crashes of artillery. The sky is cobwebbed with the criss-crossing red lines streaming from soaring bombshells, and a rain of iron fragments descends upon the city, descends upon the empty streets which are not empty a moment later, but mottled with dim figures of frantic women and children scurrying from home and bed toward the cave dungeons, encouraged by the humorous grim soldiery, who shout, "Rats to your holes!" and laugh. The cannon thunder rages, shells scream and crash overhead. The iron rain pours down, 1 hour, 2 hours, 3, possibly 6, then stops. Silence follows, but the streets are still empty. The silence continues. By and by a head projects from a cave here and there and yonder, and reconnoiters cautiously. The silence still continuing. Bodies follow heads, and jaded, half-smothered creatures group themselves about, stretch their cramped limbs, draw in deep draughts of the grateful fresh air, gossip with the neighbors from the next cave, maybe straggle off home presently, or take a lounge through the town, if the stillness continues, and will scurry to the holes again by and by, when the war tempest breaks forth once more. There being but 3,000 of these cave-dwellers, merely the population of a village, would they not come to know each other after a week or two, and familiarly, insomuch that the fortunate or unfortunate experiences of one would be of interest to all? Those are the materials furnished by history. From them might not almost anybody reproduce for himself the life of that time in Vicksburg? Could you, who did not experience it, come nearer to reproducing it to the imagination of another non-participant than could a Vicksburger who did experience it? It seems impossible, and yet there are reasons why it might not really be. When one makes his first voyage in a ship, it is an experience which multitudinously bristles with striking novelties which are in such sharp contrast with all this person's former experiences that they take a seemingly deathless grip upon his imagination and memory. By tongue or pen he can make a landsman live that strange and stirring voyage over with him, make him see it all and feel it all. But if he wait? If he make 10 voyages in succession, what then? Why, the thing has lost color, snap, surprise, and has become commonplace. The man would have nothing to tell that would quicken a landsman's pulse. Years ago I talked with a couple of the Vicksburg non-combatants, a man and his wife, left to tell their story in their own way. Those people told it without fire, almost without interest. A week of their wonderful life there would have made their tongues eloquent forever, perhaps. But they had 6 weeks of it, and that wore the novelty all out. They got used to being bomb-shelled out of home and into the ground. The matter became commonplace. After that, the possibility of their ever being startlingly interesting in their talks about it was gone. What the man said was to this effect: "It got to be Sunday all the time, 7 Sundays in the week, to us anyway. We hadn't anything to do, and time hung heavy. 7 Sundays, and all of them broken up at one time or another, in the day or in the night, by a few hours of the awful storm of fire and thunder and iron. At first we used to shin for the holes a good deal faster than we did afterwards. The first time I forgot the children, and Maria fetched them both along. When she was all safe in the cave, she fainted. 2 or 3 weeks afterwards, when she was running for the holes one morning through a shell shower, a big shell burst near her and covered her all over with dirt, and a piece of the iron carried away her game bag of false hair from the back of her head. Well, she stopped to get that game bag before she shoved along again. Was getting used to things already, you see. We all got so that we could tell a good deal about shells, and after that we didn't always go under shelter if it was a light shower. Us men would loaf around and talk, and a man would say, 'There she goes,' and name the kind of shell it was from the sound of it, and go on talking, if there wasn't any danger from it. If a shell was bursting close over us, we stopped talking and stood still. Uncomfortable, yes, but it wasn't safe to move. When it let go, we went on talking again, if nobody hurt, maybe saying, 'That was a ripper,' or some such commonplace comment before we resumed. Or, maybe, we would see a shell poising itself away high in the air overhead. In that case, every fellow just whipped out a sudden, 'See you again, gents,' and shoved. Often and often I saw gangs of ladies promenading the streets, looking as cheerful as you please, and keeping an eye canted up, watching the shells. And I've seen them stop still, when they were uncertain about what a shell was going to do, and wait and make certain, and after that they sauntered along again, or lit out for shelter, according to the verdict. Streets in some towns have a litter of pieces of paper, and odds and ends of one sort or another lying around. Ours hadn't. They had iron litter. Sometimes a man would gather up all the iron fragments and unburst shells in his neighborhood and pile them into a kind of monument in his front yard, a ton of it, sometimes. No glass left. Glass couldn't stand such a bombardment. It was all shivered out. Windows of the houses vacant, looked like eye holes in a skull. Whole panes were as scarce as news. We had church Sundays, not many there along at first, but by and by pretty good turnouts. I've seen service stop a minute and everybody sit quiet, no voice heard, pretty funeral-like then, and all the more so on account of the awful boom and crash going on outside and overhead, and pretty soon, when a body could be heard, service would go on again. Organs and church music mixed up with a bombardment is a powerful queer combination, long at first. Coming out of church one morning, we had an accident, the only one that happened around me on a Sunday. I was just having a hearty handshake with a friend I hadn't seen for a while, and saying, "Drop into our cave tonight after bombardment. We've got hold of a pint of prime whiskey, I was going to say, you know, but a shell interrupted. A chunk of it cut the man's arm off, and left it dangling in my hand. And do you know, the thing that is going to stick the longest in my memory and outlast everything else, little and big, I reckon, is the mean thought I had then. It was, 'The whiskey is saved.' And yet, don't you know, it was kind of excusable, because it was as scarce as diamonds, and we had only just that little, never had another taste during the siege. Sometimes the caves were desperately crowded, and all was hot and close. Sometimes a cave had 20 or 25 people packed into it. No turning room for anybody. Air so foul sometimes you couldn't have made a candle burn in it. A child was born in one of those caves one night. Think of that. Why, it was like having it born in a trunk. Twice we had 16 people in our cave, and a number of times we had a dozen. Pretty suffocating in there. We always had 8. 8 belonged there. Hunger and misery and sickness and fright and sorrow and I don't know what all got so loaded into them that none of them were ever rightly their old selves after the siege. They all died but 3 of us within a couple of years. One night a shell burst in front of the hole and caved it in and stopped it up. It was lively times for a while digging out. Some of us came near smothering. After that we made 2 openings. Ought to have thought of that at first. Mule meat. No, we only got down to that the last day or 2. Of course it was good. Anything is good when you're starving. This man had kept a diary during 6 weeks? No, only the first 6 days. The first day, 8 close pages. The second, 5. The third, 1, loosely written. The fourth, 3 or 4 lines. A line or 2 the 5th and 6th days. 7th day, diary abandoned. Life in terrific Vicksburg having now become commonplace and matter of course. The war history of Vicksburg has more about it to interest the general reader than that of any other of the river towns. It is full of variety, full of incident, full of the picturesque. Vicksburg held out longer than any other important river town, and saw warfare in all its phases, both land and water. The siege, the mine, the assault, the repulse, the bombardment, sickness, captivity, famine. The most beautiful of all the national cemeteries is here. Over the great gateway is this inscription: "Here rest in peace 16,600 who died for their country in the years 1861 to 1865. The grounds are nobly situated, being very high and commanding a wide prospect of land and river. They are tastefully laid out in broad terraces, with winding roads and paths, and there is profuse adornment in the way of semi-tropical shrubs and flowers, and in one part is a piece of native wildwood, left just as it grew, and therefore perfect in its charm. Everything about this cemetery suggests the hand of the national government. The government's work is always conspicuous for excellence, solidity, thoroughness, neatness. The government does its work well in the first place, and then takes care of it. By winding roads, which were often cut to so great a depth between perpendicular walls that they were mere roofless tunnels, we drove out a mile or 2 and visited the monument which stands upon the scene of the surrender of Vicksburg to General Grant by General Pemberton. Its metal will preserve it from the hackings and chippings which so defaced its predecessor, which was of marble, but the brick foundations are crumbling, and it will tumble down by and by. It overlooks a picturesque region of wooded hills and ravines, and is not unpicturesque itself, being well smothered in flowering weeds. The battered remnant of the marble monument has been removed to the National Cemetery. On the road, a quarter of a mile townward, an aged colored man showed us, with pride, an unexploded bombshell which has lain in his yard since the day it fell there during the siege. "I was a-standing here, and the dog was a-standing here. The dog, he went for the shell, going to pick up a fuss with it, but I didn't. I says, 'Just make yourself at home here. Lay still while you is, or bust up the place, just as you's a mind to. But I's got business out in the woods, I has.'" Vicksburg is a town of substantial business streets and pleasant residences. It commands the commerce of the Yazoo and the Sunflower Rivers, is pushing railways in several directions through rich agricultural regions, and has a promising future of prosperity and importance. Apparently nearly all the river towns, big and little, have made up their minds that they must look mainly to railroads for wealth and upbuilding henceforth. They are acting upon this idea. The signs are that the next 20 years will bring about some noteworthy changes in the valley in the direction of increased population and wealth, and in the intellectual advancement and the liberalizing of opinion which go naturally with these. And yet, if one may judge by the past, the river towns will manage to find and use a chance, here and there, to cripple and retard their progress. They kept themselves back in the days of steamboating supremacy, by a system of wharfage dues so stupidly graded as to prohibit what may be called small retail traffic in freights and passengers. Boats were charged such heavy wharfage that they could not afford to land for 1 or 2 passengers or a light load of freight. Instead of encouraging the bringing of trade to their doors, the towns diligently and effectively discouraged it. They could have made many boats and low rates, but their policy rendered few boats and high rates compulsory. It was a policy which extended and extends from New Orleans to St. Paul. We had a strong desire to make a trip up the Yazoo and the Sunflower, an interesting region at any time, but additionally interesting at this time, because up there the great inundation was still to be seen in force. But we were nearly sure to have to wait a day or more for a New Orleans boat on our return, so we were obliged to give up the project. Here is a story which I picked up on board the boat that night. I insert it in this place merely because it is a good story, not because it belongs here, for it doesn't. It was told by a passenger, a college professor, and was called to the surface in the course of a general conversation which began with talk about horses, drifted into talk about astronomy, then into talk about the lynching of the gamblers in Vicksburg half a century ago, then into talk about dreams and superstitions, and ended, after midnight, in a dispute over free trade and protection. Chapter 36. The Professor's Yarn. It was in the early days. I was not a college professor then. I was a humble-minded young land surveyor, with the world before me, to survey in case anybody wanted it done. I had a contract to survey a route for a great mining ditch in California, and I was on my way thither, by sea, a 3 or 4 weeks' voyage. There were a good many passengers, but I had very little to say to them. Reading and dreaming were my passions, and I avoided conversation in order to indulge these appetites. There were 3 professional gamblers on board, rough, repulsive fellows. I never had any talk with them, yet I could not help seeing them with some frequency, for they gambled in an upper-deck stateroom every day and night, and in my promenades I often had glimpses of them through their door, which stood a little ajar to let out the surplus tobacco smoke and profanity. They were an evil and hateful presence, but I had to put up with it, of course. There was one other passenger who fell under my eye a good deal, for he seemed determined to be friendly with me, and I could not have gotten rid of him without running some chance of hurting his feelings, and I was far from wishing to do that. Besides, there was something engaging in his countrified simplicity and his beaming good nature. The first time I saw this Mr. John Backus, I guessed from his clothes and his looks that he was a grazier or farmer from the backwoods of some western state, doubtless Ohio, and afterward, when he dropped into his personal history and I discovered that he was a cattle-raiser from interior Ohio, I was so pleased with my own penetration that I warmed toward him for verifying my instinct. He got to dropping alongside me every day after breakfast to help me make my promenade, and so, in the course of time, his easy-working jaw had told me everything about his business, his prospects, his family, his relatives, his politics, in fact everything that concerned a Backus, living or dead. And, meantime, I think he had managed to get out of me everything I knew about my trade, my tribe, my purposes, my prospects, and myself. He was a gentle and persuasive genius, and this thing showed it, for I was not given to talking about my matters. I said something about triangulation once. The stately word pleased his ear. He inquired what it meant. I explained. After that he quietly and inoffensively ignored my name, and always called me Triangle. What an enthusiast he was in cattle! At the bare name of a bull or a cow, his eye would light and his eloquent tongue would turn itself loose. As long as I would walk and listen, he would walk and talk. He knew all breeds. He loved all breeds. He caressed them all with his affectionate tongue. I tramped along in voiceless misery whilst the cattle question was up. When I could endure it no longer, I used to deftly insert a scientific topic into the conversation. Then my eye fired, and his faded. My tongue fluttered, his stopped. Life was a joy to me, and a sadness to him. One day he said, a little hesitatingly, and with somewhat of diffidence, "Triangle, would you mind coming down to my stateroom a minute and have a little talk on a certain matter?" I went with him at once. Arrived there, he put his head out, glanced up and down the saloon warily, then closed the door and locked it. He sat down on the sofa, and he said, "I'm a-going to make a little proposition to you, and if it strikes you favorable, it'll be a middlin' good thing for both of us. You ain't a-going out to California for fun, neither am I. It's business, ain't that so? Well, you can do me a good turn, and so can I you, if we see fit. I've raked and scraped and saved a considerable many years, and I've got it all here." He unlocked an old hair trunk, tumbled a chaos of shabby clothes aside, and drew a short stout bag into view for a moment, then buried again and relocked the trunk. Dropping his voice to a cautious low tone, he continued, "She's all there, around $10,000 in yellow boys. Now this is my little idea. What I don't know about raising cattle ain't worth knowing. There's mints of money in it in Californy. Well, I know, and you know, that all along a line that's being surveyed, there's little dabs of land that they call gores, that fall to the surveyor free gratis for nothing. All you've got to do on your side is to survey in such a way that the gores will fall on good fat land, then you turn 'em over to me. I stock 'em with cattle, in rolls the cash, I plank out your share of the dollars regular right along, and—" I was sorry to wither his blooming enthusiasm, but it could not be helped. I interrupted, and said severely, "I am not that kind of a surveyor. Let us change the subject, Mr. Backus." It was pitiful to see his confusion, and hear his awkward and shamefaced apologies. I was as much distressed as he was, especially as he seemed so far from having suspected that there was anything improper in his proposition. So I hastened to console him and lead him on to forget his mishap in a conversational orgy about cattle and butchery. We were lying at Acapulco, and as we went on deck, it happened luckily that the crew were just beginning to hoist some beeves aboard in slings. Backus's melancholy vanished instantly, and with it the memory of his late mistake. "Now only look at that!" cried he. "My goodness, Triangle, what would they say to it in Ohio? Wouldn't their eyes bug out to see 'em handled like that? Wouldn't they, though?" All the passengers were on deck to look, even the gamblers, and Backus knew them all, and had afflicted them all with his pet topic. As I moved away, I saw one of the gamblers approach and accost him, then another of them, then the third. I halted, waited, watched. The conversation continued between the four men. It grew earnest. Backus drew gradually away. The gamblers followed, and kept at his elbow. I was uncomfortable. However, as they passed me presently, I heard Backus say, with a tone of persecuted annoyance, "But it ain't any use, gentlemen. I tell you again, as I've told you a half-dozen times before, I weren't raised to it, and I ain't a-going to resk it." I felt relieved. His level head will be his sufficient protection, I said to myself. During the fortnight's run from Acapulco to San Francisco, I several times saw the gamblers talking earnestly with Backus, and once I threw out a gentle warning to him. He chuckled comfortably and said, "Oh, yes, they tag around after me considerable. Want me to play a little, just for amusement, they say. But laws o' me, if my folks have told me once to look out for that sort of livestock, they've told me 1,000 times, I reckon." By and by, in due course, we were approaching San Francisco. It was an ugly black night, with a strong wind blowing, but there was not much sea. I was on deck, alone. Toward 10 I started below. A figure issued from the gambler's den, and disappeared in the darkness. I experienced a shock, for I was sure it was Backus. I flew down the companionway, looked about for him, could not find him, then returned to the deck just in time to catch a glimpse of him as he re-entered that confounded nest of rascality. Had he yielded at last? I feared it. What had he gone below for? His bag of coin? Possibly. I drew near the door, full of bodings. It was a crack, and I glanced in and saw a sight that made me bitterly wish I had given my attention to saving my poor cattle friend, instead of reading and dreaming my foolish time away. He was gambling. Worse still, he was being plied with champagne, and was already showing some effect from it. He praised the cider, as he called it, and said now that he got a taste of it, he almost believed he would drink it if it was spirits, if it was so good and so ahead of anything he had ever run across before. Surreptitious smiles at this passed from one rascal to another, and they filled all the glasses, and whilst Bacchus honestly drained his to the bottom, they pretended to do the same, but threw the wine over their shoulders. I could not bear the scene, so I wandered forward and tried to interest myself in the sea and the voices of the wind. But no, my uneasy spirit kept dragging me back at quarter-hour intervals, and always I saw Bacchus drinking his wine, fairly and squarely, and the others throwing theirs away. It was the painfulest night I ever spent. The only hope I had was that we might reach our anchorage with speed. That would break up the game. I helped the ship along all I could with my prayers. At last we went booming through the Golden Gate, and my pulses leapt for joy. I hurried back to that door and glanced in. Alas, there was small room for hope. Bacchus's eyes were heavy and bloodshot, his sweaty face was crimson, his speech maudlin and thick, his body sawed drunkenly about with the weaving motion of the ship. He drained another glass to the dregs whilst the cards were being dealt. He took his hand, glanced at it, and his dull eyes lit up for a moment. The gamblers observed it, and showed their gratification by hardly perceptible signs. 'How many cards?' 'None,' said Bacchus. One villain, named Hank Wiley, discarded one card, the others 3 each. The betting began. Heretofore the bets had been trifling, $1 or 2, but Bacchus started off with an eagle now. Wiley hesitated a moment, then saw it, and went $10 better. The other 2 threw up their hands. Bacchus went 20 better. Wiley said, 'I see that, and go you 100 better,' then smiled and reached for the money. 'Let it alone,' said Bacchus, with drunken gravity. 'What? You mean to say you're going to cover it?' 'Cover it? Well, I reckon I am. I lay another 100 on top of it, too.' He reached down inside his overcoat and produced the required sum. 'Oh, that's your little game, is it? I see your raise, and raise it 500, said Wiley. 500 better, said the foolish bull driver, and pulled out the sum and showered it on the pile. The 3 conspirators hardly tried to conceal their exultation. All diplomacy and pretense were dropped now, and the sharp exclamations came thick and fast as the yellow pyramid grew higher and higher. At last $10,000 lay in view. Wiley cast a bag of coin on the table, and said with mocking gentleness, $5,000 better, my friend from the rural districts. What do you say now?' 'I call you,' said Bacchus, heaving his golden shot bag on the pile. 'What have you got?' 4 kings, you ding fool!' And Wiley threw down his cards and surrounded the stakes with his arms. 4 aces, you ass!' thundered Bacchus, covering his man with a cocked revolver. 'I'm a professional gambler myself, and I've been laying for you duffers all this voyage.' Down went the anchor, rumbledy-dum-dum, and the long trip was ended. Well, well, it is a sad world. One of the 3 gamblers was Bacchus's pal. It was he that dealt the fateful hands. According to an understanding with the 2 victims, he was to have given Bacchus 4 queens, but alas, he didn't. A week later I stumbled upon Bacchus, arrayed in the height of fashion, in Montgomery Street. He said, cheerily, as we were parting, 'Ah, by the way, you needn't mind about those gores. I don't really know anything about cattle, except what I was able to pick up in a week's apprenticeship over in Jersey just before we sailed. My cattle culture and cattle enthusiasm have served their turn. I shan't need them any more. Next day we reluctantly parted from the Gold Dust and her officers, hoping to see that boat and all those officers again some day, a thing which the fates were to render tragically impossible. Chapter 37. The End of the Gold Dust. For 3 months later, August 8, while I was writing one of these foregoing chapters, the New York papers brought this telegram: "A terrible disaster. 17 persons killed by an explosion on the steamer Gold Dust." Nashville, August 7. A dispatch from Hickman, Kentucky, says: "The steamer Gold Dust exploded her boilers at 3 o'clock today, just after leaving Hickman. 47 persons were scalded, and 17 are missing." The boat was landed in the eddy just above the town, and through the exertions of the citizens, the cabin passengers, officers, and part of the crew and deck passengers were taken ashore and removed to the hotels and residences. 24 of the injured were lying in Holkman's dry goods store at one time, where they received every attention before being removed to more comfortable places. A list of the names followed, whereby it appeared that of the 17 dead, 1 was the barkeeper, and among the 47 wounded were the captain, chief mate, second mate, and second and third clerks. Also Mr. Lem S. Gray, pilot, and several members of the crew. In answer to a private telegram, we learned that none of these was severely hurt, except Mr. Gray. Letters received afterward confirmed this news, and said that Mr. Gray was improving and would get well. Later letters spoke less hopefully of his case, and finally came one announcing his death. A good man, a most companionable and manly man, and worthy of a kindlier fate. Chapter 38. The House Beautiful. We took passage in a Cincinnati boat for New Orleans, or on a Cincinnati boat. Either is correct. The former is the eastern form of putting it, the latter is the western. Mr. Dickens declined to agree that the Mississippi steamboats were magnificent, or that they were floating palaces, terms which had always been applied to them, terms which did not over-express the admiration with which the people viewed them. Mr. Dickens' position was unassailable, possibly. The people's position was certainly unassailable. If Mr. Dickens was comparing these boats with the Crown Jewels, or with the Taj, or with the Matterhorn, or with some other priceless or wonderful thing which he had seen, then they were not magnificent. He was right. The people compared them with what they had seen, and thus measured, thus judged, the boats were magnificent. The term was the correct one. It was not at all too strong. The people were as right as was Mr. Dickens. The steamboats were finer than anything on shore. Compared with superior dwelling-houses and first-class hotels in the valley, they were indubitably magnificent. They were palaces. To a few people living in New Orleans and St. Louis, they were not magnificent, perhaps, not palaces, but to the great majority of those populations, and to the entire population spread over both banks between Baton Rouge and St. Louis, they were palaces. They tallied with the citizen's dream of what magnificence was, and satisfied it. Every town and village along that vast stretch of double river frontage had a best dwelling, finest dwelling, mansion, the home of its wealthiest and most conspicuous citizen. It is easy to describe it: large grassy yard with paling fence painted white, in fair repair, brick walk from gate to door, big, square, 2-story frame house, painted white and porticoed like a Grecian temple, with this difference, that the imposing fluted columns and Corinthian capitals were a pathetic sham, being made of white pine and painted. Iron knocker, brass doorknob, discolored for lack of polishing. Within, an uncarpeted hall of planed boards. opening out of it a parlor 15 feet by 15, in some instances 5 or 10 feet larger. Ingrain carpet, mahogany center table, lamp on it with green paper shade, standing on a gridiron, so to speak, made of high-colored yarns by the young ladies of the house, and called a lamp mat. Several books piled and disposed with cast-iron exactness, according to an inherited and unchangeable plan, among them Tupper, much penciled, also Friendship's Offering, and Affection's Wreath, with their sappy inanities illustrated in die-away mezzotints, also Ossian, Alonzo and Melissa, maybe Ivanhoe, also Album, full of original poetry of the "Thou hast wounded the spirit that loved thee" breed. 2 or 3 goody-goody works, Shepherd of Salisbury Plain, etc., current number of the chaste and innocuous Goodies Ladies' Book, with painted fashion plate of wax figure women with mouths all alike, lips and eyelids the same size, each 5-foot woman with a 2-inch wedge sticking from under her dress and letting on to be half of her foot. Polished airtight stove, new and deadly invention, with pipe passing through a board which closes up the discarded old fireplace. On each end of the wooden mantel over the fireplace a large basket of peaches and other fruits, natural size, all done in plaster, rudely, or in wax, and painted to resemble the originals, which they don't. Over middle of mantel, engraving, Washington crossing the Delaware. On the wall by the door, copy of it done in thunder and lightning crewels by one of the young ladies, work of art which would have made Washington hesitate about crossing, if he could have foreseen what advantage was going to be taken of it. Piano, kettle in disguise, with music, bound and unbound, piled on it, and on a stand nearby. Battle of Prague, Bird Waltz, Arkansas Traveler, Rosin the Bow, Marseille Hymn, on a lone barren isle, St. Helena, the last link is broken. She wore a wreath of roses the night when last we met. Go, forget me, why should sorrow o'er that brow a shadow fling? Hours there were to memory dearer, long, long ago, days of absence, a life on the ocean wave, a home on the rolling deep, bird at sea, and spread open on the rack where the plaintive singer has left it, row whole on, silver moon, guide the traveler his way, etc. Tilted pensively against the piano, a guitar capable of playing the Spanish fandango by itself, if you give it a start. Frantic work of art on the wall, pious motto, done on the premises, sometimes in colored yarns, sometimes in faded grasses. Progenitor of the God Bless Our Home of modern commerce. Framed in black moldings on the wall, other works of arts, conceived and committed on the premises by the young ladies, being grim black and white crayons, landscapes mostly, lake, solitary sailboat, petrified clouds, pre-geological trees on shore, anthracite precipice, name of criminal conspicuous in the corner. Lithograph, Napoleon crossing the Alps. Lithograph, the grave at St. Helena. Steel plates, Trumbull's Battle of Bunker Hill, and the sally from Gibraltar. Copper plates, Moses smiting the rock, and Return of the Prodigal Son. In the big gilt frame, Slander the Family in Oil. Papa holding a book, Constitution of the United States. Guitar leaning against Mama. Blue ribbons fluttering from its neck. The young ladies, as children, in slippers and scalloped pantalettes, one embracing toy horse, the other beguiling kitten with ball of yarn, and both simpering up at Mama, who simpers back. These persons all fresh, raw, and red, apparently skinned. Opposite, in gilt frame, Grandpa and Grandma at 30 and 22, stiff, old-fashioned, high-collared, puff-sleeved, glaring pallidly out from a background of solid Egyptian night. Under a glass French clock dome, large bouquet of stiff flowers done in corpsey white wax. Pyramidal what-not in the corner, the shelves occupied chiefly with bric-a-brac of the period, disposed with an eye to best effect. shell with the Lord's Prayer carved on it. Another shell, of the long oval sort, narrow, straight orifice 3 inches long, running from end to end, portrait of Washington carved on it, not well done. The shell had Washington's mouth originally. Artists should have built to that. These two are memorials of the long-ago bridal trip to New Orleans and the French market. Other bric-a-brac, California specimens, quartz with gold wart adhering, old Guinea gold locket with circlet of ancestral hair in it, Indian arrowheads of flint, pair of bead moccasins from uncle who crossed the plains, 3 alum baskets of various colors, being skeleton frame of wire clothed on with cubes of crystallized alum in the rock candy style, works of art which were achieved by the young ladies, their doubles and duplicates to be found upon all whatnots in the land. Convention of desiccated bugs and butterflies pinned to a card. Painted toy dog seated upon bellows attachment, drops its underjaw and squeaks when pressed upon. Sugar candy rabbit, limbs and features merged together, not strongly defined. Pewter presidential campaign medal. Miniature cardboard wood sawyer, to be attached to the stovepipe and operated by the heat. Small Napoleon done in wax. Spread open daguerreotypes of dim children, parents, cousins, aunts, and friends, in all attitudes but customary ones. No templed portico at back, and manufactured landscapes stretching away in the distance. That came in later, with the photograph. All these vague figures lavishly chained and ringed, metal indicated and secured from doubt by stripes and splashes of vivid gold bronze, all of them too much combed, too much fixed up, and all of them uncomfortable in inflexible Sunday clothes of a pattern which the spectator cannot realize could ever have been in fashion. Husband and wife generally grouped together, husband sitting, wife standing, with hand on his shoulder, and both preserving all these fading years some traceable effect of the daguerreotype's brisk, "Now smile, if you please." Bracketed over whatnot, place of special sacredness, an outrage in watercolor done by the young niece that came on a visit long ago, and died. Pity, too, for she might have repented of this in time. Horsehair chairs, horsehair sofa which keeps sliding from under you, window shades of oil stuff, with milkmaids and ruined castles stenciled on them in fierce colors, lambrequins dependent from gaudy boxings of beaten tin, gilded, bedrooms with rag carpets, bedsteads of corded sort with a sag in the middle, the cords needing tightening, snuffy feather bed, not aired often enough, cane seat chairs, splint-bottomed rocker, looking-glass on wall, school slate size, veneered frame, inherited bureau, wash-bowl and pitcher, possibly, but not certainly, brass candlestick, tallow candle, snuffers, nothing else in the room, not a bathroom in the house, and no visitor likely to come along who has ever seen one. That was the residence of the principal citizen all the way from the suburbs of New Orleans to the edge of St. Louis. When he stepped aboard a big fine steamboat, he entered a new and marvelous world. Chimney tops cut to counterfeit a spraying crown of plumes, and maybe painted red, pilot house, hurricane deck, boiler deck guards, all garnished with white wooden filigree work of fanciful patterns, gilt acorns topping the derricks, gilt deer horns over the big bell, gaudy symbolical picture on the paddle box, possibly, big roomy boiler deck painted blue and furnished with Windsor armchairs, inside a far receding snow-white cabin, porcelain knob and oil picture on every stateroom door, curving patterns of filigree work touched up with gilding, stretching overhead all down the converging vista. Big chandeliers every little way, each an April shower of glittering glass drops. Lovely rainbow light falling everywhere from the colored glazing of the skylights. The whole a long-drawn resplendent tunnel, a bewildering and soul-satisfying spectacle. In the ladies' cabin a pink and white Wilton carpet, as soft as mush and glorified with a ravishing pattern of gigantic flowers. Then the bridal chamber, The animal that invented that idea was still alive and unhanged at that day, bridal chamber whose pretentious flummery was necessarily overawing to the now tottering intellect of that hosannaing citizen. Every stateroom had its couple of cozy clean bunks, and perhaps a looking-glass and a snug closet, and sometimes there was even a wash-bowl and pitcher, and part of a towel, which could be told from mosquito-netting by an expert, though generally these things were absent, and the shirt-sleeved passengers cleansed themselves at a long row of stationary bowls in the barber shop, where were also public towels, public combs, and public soap. Take the steamboat which I have just described, and you have her in her highest and finest and most pleasing and comfortable and satisfactory estate. Now cake her over with a layer of ancient and obdurate dirt, and you have the Cincinnati steamer a while ago referred to. Not all over, only inside, for she was ably officered in all departments except the steward's. But wash that boat and repaint her, and she would be about the counterpart of the most complimented boat of the old flush times, for the steamboat architecture of the West has undergone no change, neither has steamboat furniture and ornamentation undergone any. Chapter 39. Manufacturers and Miscreants. Where the river, in the Vicksburg region, used to be corkscrewed, it is now comparatively straight, made so by cut-off. A former distance of 70 miles is reduced to 35. It is a change which threw Vicksburg's neighbor, Delta, Louisiana, out into the country, and ended its career as a river town. Its whole river frontage is now occupied by a vast sandbar, thickly covered with young trees, a growth which will magnify itself into a dense forest by and by, and completely hide the exiled town. In due time we passed Grand Gulf and Rodney, of war fame, and reached Natchez, the last of the beautiful hill cities, for Baton Rouge, yet to come, is not on a hill, but only on a high ground. Famous Natchez under the hill has not changed notably in 20 years. In outward aspect, judging by the descriptions of the ancient procession of foreign tourists, it has not changed in 60, for it is still small, straggling, and shabby. It had a desperate reputation, morally, in the old keel-boating and early steamboating times. Plenty of drinking, carousing, fisticuffing, and killing there, among the riffraff of the river, in those days. But Natchez on top of the hill is attractive, has always been attractive. Even Mrs. Trollope, 1827, had to confess its charms. At one or two points the wearisome level line is relieved by bluffs, as they call the short intervals of high ground. The town of Natchez is beautifully situated on one of those high spots. The contrast that its bright green hill forms with the dismal line of black forest that stretches on every side, the abundant growth of the pawpaw, palmetto, and orange, the copious variety of sweet-scented flowers that flourish there, all make it appear like an oasis in the desert. Natchez is the furthest point to the north at which oranges ripen in the open air, or endure the winter without shelter. With the exception of this sweet spot, I thought all the little towns and villages we passed wretched-looking in the extreme. Natchez, like her near and far river neighbors, has railways now, and is adding to them, pushing them hither and thither into all rich outlying regions that are naturally tributary to her. And, like Vicksburg and New Orleans, she has her ice factory. She makes 30 tons of ice a day. In Vicksburg and Natchez, in my time, ice was jewelry. None but the rich could wear it. But anybody and everybody can have it now. I visited one of the ice factories in New Orleans to see what the polar regions might look like when lugged into the edge of the tropics, but there was nothing striking in the aspect of the place. It was merely a spacious house, with some innocent steam machinery in one end of it, and some big porcelain pipes running here and there. No, not porcelain, they merely seemed to be. They were iron, but the ammonia which was being breathed through them had coated them to the thickness of your hand with solid milk-white ice. It ought to have melted, for one did not require winter clothing in that atmosphere,
but it did not melt. The inside of the pipe was too cold. Sunk into the floor were numberless tin boxes, a foot square and 2 feet long, and open at the top end. These were full of clear water, and around each box salt and other proper stuff was packed. Also, the ammonia gases were applied to the water in some way which will always remain a secret to me, because I was not able to understand the process. While the water in the boxes gradually froze, men gave it a stir or two with a stick occasionally, to liberate the air bubbles, I think. Other men were continually lifting out boxes whose contents had become hard frozen. They gave the box a single dip into a vat of boiling water to melt the block of ice free from its tin coffin. Then they shot the block out upon a platform car, and it was ready for market. These big blocks were hard, solid, and crystal clear. In certain of them, big bouquets of fresh and brilliant tropical flowers had been frozen in. In others, beautiful silken-clad French dolls, and other pretty objects. These blocks were to be set on end in a platter, in the center of dinner tables, to cool the tropical air, and also to be ornamental, for the flowers and things imprisoned in them could be seen as through plate glass. I was told that this factory could retail its ice, by wagon, throughout New Orleans, in the humblest dwelling-house quantities, at $6 or $7 a ton, and make a sufficient profit. This being the case, there is business for ice factories in the North, for we get ice on no such terms there, if one take less than 350 pounds at a delivery. The Rosalie Yarn Mill of Natchez has a capacity of 6,000 spindles and 160 looms, and employs 100 hands. The Natchez Cotton Mills Company began operations 4 years ago in a 2-story building of 50 by 190 feet, with 4,000 spindles and 128 looms. Capital $105,000, all subscribed in the town. 2 years later, the same stockholders increased their capital to $225,000, added a 3rd story to the mill, increased its length to 317 feet, added machinery to increase the capacity to 10,300 spindles and 304 looms. The company now employs 250 operatives, many of whom are citizens of Natchez. The mill works 5,000 bales of cotton annually and manufactures the best standard quality of brown shirtings and sheetings and drills, turning out 5 million yards of these goods per year. Footnote: New Orleans Times-Democrat, 26 August 1882. A close corporation, stock held at $5,000 per share, but none in the market. The changes in the Mississippi River are great and strange, yet were to be expected, but I was not expecting to live to see Natchez and these other river towns become manufacturing strongholds and railway centers. Speaking of manufactures, reminds me of a talk upon that topic which I overheard, on board the Cincinnati boat. I woke out of a fretted sleep with a dull confusion of voices in my ears. I listened. 2 men were talking. Subject, apparently, the great inundation. I looked out through the open transom. The 2 men were eating a late breakfast, sitting opposite each other, nobody else around. They closed up the inundation with a few words, having used it, evidently, as a mere icebreaker and acquaintanceship breeder. Then they dropped into business. It soon transpired that they were drummers, one belonging in Cincinnati, the other in New Orleans. Brisk men, energetic of movement and speech, the dollar their god, how to get it their religion. "Now, as to this article," said Cincinnati, slashing into the ostensible butter and holding forward a slab of it on his knife-blade, "it's from our house. Look at it. Smell of it. Taste it. Put any test on it you want to. Take your own time, no hurry, make it thorough. There now, what do you say? Butter, ain't it? Not by a thundering sight. It's oleomargarine. Yes, sir, that's what it is, oleomargarine. You can't tell it from butter. By George, an expert can't. It's from our house. We supply most of the boats in the West. There's hardly a pound of butter on one of them. We are crawling right along, jumping right along is the word. We are going to have that entire trade. Yes, and the hotel trade, too. You are going to see the day, pretty soon, when you can't find an ounce of butter to bless yourself with in any hotel in the Mississippi and Ohio valleys outside of the biggest cities. Why, we are turning out oleomargarine now by the thousands of tons, and we can sell it so dirt cheap that the whole country has got to take it. Can't get around it, you see. Butter don't stand any show. There ain't any chance for competition. Butter's had its day, and from this out, butter goes to the wall. There's more money in oleomargarine than, why, you can't imagine the business we do. I've stopped in every town from Cincinnati to Natchez, and I've sent home big orders from every one of them. And so forth and so on, for 10 minutes longer in the same fervid strain. Then New Orleans piped up and said, "Yes, it's a first-rate imitation, that's a certainty. But it ain't the only one around that's first-rate. For instance, they make olive oil out of cottonseed oil nowadays, so that you can't tell them apart." "Yes, that's so," responded Cincinnati, "and it was a tip-top business for a while. They sent it over and brought it back from France and Italy with the United States Customs House mark on it to endorse it for genuine, and there was no end of cash in it. But France and Italy broke up the game, of course they naturally would, cracked on such a rattling impost that cottonseed olive oil couldn't stand the raise, had to hang it up and quit." "Oh, it did it? You wait here a minute." Goes to his stateroom, brings back a couple of long bottles, and takes out the corks, says, "There now, smell them, taste them, examine the bottles, inspect the labels. One of 'em's from Europe, the other's never been out of this country. One's European olive oil, the other's American cottonseed olive oil. Tell 'em apart? Of course you can't. Nobody can. People that want to can go to the expense and trouble of shipping their oils to Europe and back. It's their privilege. But our firm knows a trick worth 6 of that. We turn out the whole thing, clean from the word go, in our factory in New Orleans. Labels, bottles, oil, everything. Well, no, not labels. Been buying them abroad. Get them dirt cheap there. You see, there's just one little wee speck, essence or whatever it is, in a gallon of cottonseed oil that give it a smell or a flavor or something. Get that out, and you're all right. Perfectly easy then to turn the oil into any kind of oil you want to, and there ain't anybody that can detect the true from the false. Well, we know how to get that one little particle out, and we're the only firm that does. And we turn out an olive oil that is just simply perfect, undetectable. We are doing a ripping trade, too, as I could easily show you by my order book for this trip. Maybe you'll butter everybody's bread pretty soon, but we'll cottonseed his salad for him from the Gulf to Canada, and that's a dead certain thing." Cincinnati glowed and flashed with admiration. The two scoundrels exchanged business cards and rose. As they left the table, Cincinnati said, "But you have to have custom house marks, don't you? How do you manage that?" I did not catch the answer. We passed Port Hudson, scene of 2 of the most terrific episodes of the war, the night battle there between Farragut's fleet and the Confederate land batteries, April 14th, 1863, and the memorable land battle 2 months later, which lasted 8 hours, 8 hours of exceptionally fierce and stubborn fighting, and ended finally in the repulse of the Union forces with great slaughter. Chapter 40. Castles and Culture. Baton Rouge was clothed in flowers like a bride, no, much more so, like a greenhouse. For we were in the absolute South now, no modifications, no compromises, no halfway measures. The magnolia trees in the Capitol grounds were lovely and fragrant, with their dense, rich foliage and huge snowball blossoms. The scent of the flower is very sweet, but you want distance on it, because it is so powerful. They are not good bedroom blossoms. They might suffocate one in his sleep. We were certainly in the South at last, for here the sugar region begins, and the plantations, vast green levels, with sugar mill and negro quarters clustered together in the middle distance, were in view. And there was a tropical sun overhead, and a tropical swelter in the air. And at this point also begins the pilot's paradise, a wide river hence to New Orleans, abundance of water from shore to shore, and no bars, snags, sawyers, or wrecks in his road. Sir Walter Scott is probably responsible for the Capitol building, for it is not conceivable that this little sham castle would ever have been built if he had not run the people mad a couple of generations ago with his medieval romances. The South has not yet recovered from the debilitating influence of his books. Admiration of his fantastic heroes and their grotesque chivalry doings and romantic juvenilities still survives here in an atmosphere in which is already perceptible the wholesome and practical 19th century smell of cotton factories and locomotives, and traces of its inflated language and other windy humbuggeries survive along with it. It is pathetic enough that a whitewashed castle with turrets and things, materials all ungenuine within and without, pretending to be what they are not, should ever have been built in this otherwise honorable place. But it is much more pathetic to see this architectural falsehood undergoing restoration and perpetuation in our day, when it would have been so easy to let dynamite finish what a charitable fire began, and then devote this restoration money to the building of something genuine. Baton Rouge has no patent on imitation castles, however, and no monopoly of them. Here is a picture from the advertisement of the Female Institute of Columbia, Tennessee. The following remark is from the same advertisement. The Institute building has long been famed as a model of striking and beautiful architecture. Visitors are charmed with its resemblance to the old castles of song and story, with its towers and turreted walls and ivy-mantled porches. Keeping school in a castle is a romantic thing, as romantic as keeping hotel in a castle. By itself, the imitation castle is doubtless harmless, and well enough, but as a symbol and breeder and sustainer of maudlin middle-age romanticism here in the midst of the plainest and sturdiest and infinitely greatest and worthiest of all the centuries the world has seen, it is necessarily a hurtful thing and a mistake. Here is an extract from the prospectus of a Kentucky female college. Female college sounds well enough, but since the phrasing it in that unjustifiable way was done purely in the interest of brevity, it seems to me that she college would have been still better, because shorter, and means the same thing. That is, if either phrase means anything at all. The President is Southern by birth, by rearing, by education, and by sentiment. The teachers are all Southern in sentiment, and with the exception of those born in Europe, were born and raised in the South. Believing the Southern to be the highest type of civilization this continent has seen, the young ladies are trained according to the Southern ideas of delicacy, refinement, womanhood, religion, and propriety. Hence we offer a first-class female college for the South and solicit Southern patronage. Footnote: illustrations of it thoughtlessly omitted by the advertiser. Knoxville, Tennessee, October 19. This morning, a few minutes after 10 o'clock, General Joseph A. Mabry, Thomas O'Connor, and Joseph A. Mabry, Jr. were killed in a shooting affray. The difficulty began yesterday afternoon by General Mabry attacking Major O'Connor and threatening to kill him. This was at the fairgrounds, and O'Connor told Mabry that it was not the place to settle their difficulties. Mabry then told O'Connor he should not live. It seems that Mabry was armed and O'Connor was not. The cause of the difficulty was an old feud about the transfer of some property from Mabry to O'Connor. Later in the afternoon, Mabry sent word to O'Connor that he would kill him on sight. This morning, Major O'Connor was standing in the door of the Mechanics' National Bank, of which he was president, General Mabry and another gentleman walking down Gay Street on the opposite side from the bank. O'Connor stepped into the bank, got a shotgun, took deliberate aim at General Mabry, and fired. Mabry fell dead, being shot in the left side. As he fell, O'Connor fired again, the shot taking effect in Mabry's thigh. O'Connor then reached into the bank and got another shotgun. About this time, Joseph A. Mabry, Jr., son of General Mabry, came rushing down the street unseen by O'Connor until within 40 feet, when the young man fired a pistol. the shot taking effect in O'Connor's right breast, passing through the body near the heart. The instant Mabry shot, O'Connor turned and fired, the load taking effect in young Mabry's right breast and side. Mabry fell pierced with 20 buckshot, and almost instantly O'Connor fell dead without a struggle. Mabry tried to rise, but fell back dead. The whole tragedy occurred within 2 minutes, and neither of the three spoke after he was shot. General Mabry had about 30 buckshot in his body. A bystander was painfully wounded in the thigh with a buckshot, and another was wounded in the arm. 4 other men had their clothing pierced by buckshot. The affair caused great excitement, and Gay Street was thronged with thousands of people. General Mabry and his son Joe were acquitted only a few days ago of the murder of Moses Lusby and Don Lusby, father and son, whom they killed a few weeks ago. Will Mabry was killed by Don Lusby last Christmas. Major Thomas O'Connor was president of the Mechanics' National Bank here, and was the wealthiest man in the state. Associated Press telegram. One day last month, Professor Sharp of Somerville, Tennessee, female college, a quiet and gentlemanly man, was told that his brother-in-law, a Captain Burton, had threatened to kill him. Burton, it seems, had already killed one man and driven his knife into another. The professor armed himself with a double-barreled shotgun, started out in search of his brother-in-law, found him playing billiards in a saloon, and blew his brains out. The Memphis Avalanche reports that the professor's course met with pretty general approval in the community. Knowing that the law was powerless in the actual condition of public sentiment to protect him, he protected himself. About the same time, 2 young men in North Carolina quarreled about a girl, and hostile messages were exchanged. Friends tried to reconcile them, but had their labor for their pains. On the 24th, the young men met in the public highway. One of them had a heavy club in his hand, the other an axe. The man with the club fought desperately for his life, but it was a hopeless fight from the first. A well-directed blow sent his club whirling out of his grasp, and the next moment he was a dead man. About the same time, 2 highly connected young Virginians, clerks in a hardware store at Charlottesville, while skylarking, came to blows. Peter Dick threw pepper in Charles Rhodes' eyes. Rhodes demanded an apology. Dick refused to give it, and it was agreed that a duel was inevitable. But a difficulty arose. The parties had no pistols, and it was too late at night to procure them. One of them suggested that butcher knives would answer the purpose, and the other accepted the suggestion. The result was that Rhodes fell to the floor with a gash in his abdomen that may or may not prove fatal. If Dick has been arrested, the news has not reached us. He expressed deep regret, and we are told by a Staunton correspondent of the Philadelphia Press that every effort has been made to hush the matter up. Extracts from the public journals. What? Warder Ho! The man that can blow so complacent a blast as that probably blows it from a castle. From Baton Rouge to New Orleans, the great sugar plantations border both sides of the river all the way, and stretch their league-wide levels back to the dim forest walls of bearded cypress in the rear. Shores lonely no longer, plenty of dwellings all the way on both banks, standing so close together for long distances that the broad river lying between the 2 rows becomes a sort of spacious street. A most homelike and happy-looking region, and now and then you see a pillared and porticoed great manor house embowered in trees. Here is testimony of 1 or 2 of the procession of foreign tourists that filed along here half a century ago. Mrs. Trollope says, "The unbroken flatness of the banks of the Mississippi continued unvaried for many miles above New Orleans. But the graceful and luxuriant palmetto, the dark and noble ilex, and the bright orange were everywhere to be seen, and it was many days before we were weary of looking at them." Captain Basil Hall. The district of country which lies adjacent to the Mississippi in the lower parts of Louisiana is everywhere thickly peopled by sugar planters, whose showy houses, gay piazzas, trig gardens, and numerous slave villages, all clean and neat, gave an exceedingly thriving air to the river scenery. All the procession paint the attractive picture in the same way. The descriptions of 50 years ago do not need to have a word changed in order to exactly describe the same region as it appears today, except as to the trigness of the houses. The whitewash is gone from the negro cabins now, and many, possibly most, of the big mansions, once so shining white, have worn out their paint and have a decayed, neglected look. It is the blight of the war. 21 years ago everything was trim and trig and bright along the coast, just as it had been in 1827 as described by those tourists. Unfortunate tourists! People humbugged them with stupid and silly lies, and then laughed at them for believing and printing the same. They told Mrs. Trollope that the alligators, or crocodiles as she calls them, were terrible creatures, and backed up the statement with a blood-curdling account of how one of these slandered reptiles crept into a squatter cabin one night and ate up a woman and 5 children. The woman by herself would have satisfied any ordinarily impossible alligator, but no, these liars must make him gorge the 5 children besides. One would not imagine that jokers of this robust breed would be sensitive, but they were. It is difficult at this day to understand, and impossible to justify, the reception which the book of the grave, honest, intelligent, gentle, manly, charitable, well-meaning Captain Basil Hall got. Chapter 41. The Metropolis of the South. The approaches to New Orleans were familiar. General aspects were unchanged. When one goes flying through London along a railway propped in the air on tall arches, he may inspect miles of upper bedrooms through the open windows, but the lower half of the houses is under his level and out of sight. Similarly, in High River Stage, in the New Orleans region, the water is up to the top of the enclosing levee rim. The flat country behind it lies low, representing the bottom of a dish, and as the boat swims along, high on the flood, one looks down upon the houses and into the upper windows. There is nothing but that frail breastwork of earth between the people and destruction. The old brick salt warehouses clustered at the upper end of the city looked as they had always looked. Warehouses which had had a kind of Aladdin's lamp experience, however, since I had seen them. For when the war broke out, the proprietor went to bed one night leaving them packed with thousands of sacks of vulgar salt, worth a couple of dollars a sack, and got up in the morning and found his mountain of salt turned into a mountain of gold, so to speak, so suddenly and to so dizzy a height had the war news sent up the price of the article. The vast reach of plank wharves remained unchanged, and there were as many ships as ever. But the long array of steamboats had vanished. Not altogether, of course, but not much of it was left. The city itself had not changed to the eye. It had greatly increased in spread and population, but the look of the town was not altered. The dust, waste-paper littered, was still deep in the streets. The deep, trough-like gutters alongside the curbstones were still half full of reposeful water with a dusty surface. The sidewalks were still, in the sugar and bacon region, encumbered by casks and barrels and hogsheads. The great blocks of austerely plain commercial houses were as dusty-looking as ever. Canal Street was finer, and more attractive and stirring than formerly, with its drifting crowds of people, its several processions of hurrying street-cars, and, toward evening, its broad second-story verandas crowded with gentlemen and ladies clothed according to the latest mode. Not that there is any architecture in Canal Street. To speak in broad general terms, there is no architecture in New Orleans, except in the cemeteries. It seems a strange thing to say of a wealthy, far-seeing, and energetic city of 250,000 inhabitants, but it is true. There is a huge granite U.S. Custom House, costly enough, genuine enough, but as a decoration it is inferior to a gasometer. It looks like a state prison, but it was built before the war. Architecture in America may be said to have been born since the war. New Orleans, I believe, has had the good luck, and in a sense the bad luck, to have had no great fire in late years. It must be so.
If the opposite had been the case, I think one would be able to tell the burnt district by the radical improvement in its architecture over the old forms. One can do this in Boston and Chicago. The burnt district of Boston was commonplace before the fire, but now there is no commercial district in any city in the world that can surpass it, or perhaps even rival it, in beauty, elegance, and tastefulness. However, New Orleans has begun, just this moment, as one may say. When completed, the new Cotton Exchange will be a stately and beautiful building, massive and substantial, full of architectural graces. No shams or false pretenses or uglinesses about it anywhere. To the city, it will be worth many times its cost, for it will breed its species. What has been lacking hitherto was a model to build toward, something to educate eye and taste, a suggester, so to speak. The city is well outfitted with progressive men, thinking, sagacious, long-headed men. The contrast between the spirit of the city and the city's architecture is like the contrast between waking and sleep. Apparently there is a boom in everything but that one dead feature. The water in the gutters used to be stagnant and slimy, and a potent disease breeder, but the gutters are flushed now, 2 or 3 times a day, by powerful machinery. In many of the gutters the water never stands still, but has a steady current. Other sanitary improvements have been made, and with such effect that New Orleans claims to be, during the long intervals between occasional yellow fever assaults, one of the healthiest cities in the Union. There's plenty of ice now for everybody, manufactured in the town. It is a driving place commercially, and has a great river, ocean, and railway business. At the date of our visit, it was the best lighted city in the Union, electrically speaking. The New Orleans electric lights were more numerous than those of New York, and very much better. One had this modified noonday not only in Canal and some neighboring chief streets, but all along a stretch of 5 miles of river frontage. There are good clubs in the city now, several of them but recently organized, and inviting modern-style pleasure resorts at West End and Spanish Fort. The telephone is everywhere. One of the most notable advances is in journalism. The newspapers, as I remember them, were not a striking feature. Now they are. Money is spent upon them with a free hand. They get the news, let it cost what it may. The editorial work is not hack-grinding, but literature. As an example of New Orleans' journalistic achievement, it may be mentioned that the Times Democrat of August 26, 1882, contained a report of the year's business of the towns of the Mississippi Valley, from New Orleans all the way to St. Paul, 2,000 miles. That issue of the paper consisted of 40 pages, 7 columns to the page, 280 columns in all, 1,500 words to the column, an aggregate of 420,000 words. That is to say, not much short of 3 times as many words as there are in this book. One may with sorrow contrast this with the architecture of New Orleans. I have been speaking of public architecture only. The domestic article in New Orleans is reproachless, notwithstanding it remains as it always was. All the dwellings are of wood, in the American part of the town, I mean, and all have a comfortable look. Those in the wealthy quarter are spacious, painted snow-white usually, and generally have wide verandas, or double verandas, supported by ornamental columns. These mansions stand in the center of large grounds, and rise, garlanded with roses, out of the midst of swelling masses of shining green foliage and many-colored blossoms. No houses could well be in better harmony with their surroundings, or more pleasing to the eye, or more homelike and comfortable looking. One even becomes reconciled to the cistern presently. This is a mighty cask, painted green, and sometimes a couple of stories high, which is propped against the house corner on stilts. There is a mansion and brewery suggestion about the combination which seems very incongruous at first, but the people cannot have wells, and so they take rain-water. Neither can they conveniently have cellars or graves. Footnote:
The Israelites are buried in graves, by permission, I take it, not requirement, but none else, except the destitute, who are buried at public expense. The graves are but 3 or 4 feet deep. Neither can they conveniently have cellars or graves, the town being built upon made ground. So they do without both, and few of the living complain, and none of the others. Chapter 42. Hygiene and Sentiment. They bury their dead in vaults above the ground. These vaults have a resemblance to houses, sometimes to temples, are built of marble generally, are architecturally graceful and shapely. They face the walks and driveways of the cemetery, and when one moves through the midst of 1,000 or so of them, and sees their white roofs and gables stretching into the distance on every hand, the phrase "City of the Dead" has all at once a meaning to him. Many of the cemeteries are beautiful, and are kept in perfect order. When one goes from the levee or the business streets near it to a cemetery, he observes to himself that if those people down there would live as neatly while they are alive as they do after they are dead, they would find many advantages in it. And besides, their quarter would be the wonder and admiration of the business world. Fresh flowers, in vases of water, are to be seen at the portals of many of the vaults, placed there by the pious hands of bereaved parents and children, husbands and wives, and renewed daily. A milder form of sorrow finds its inexpensive and lasting remembrancer in the coarse and ugly but indestructible immortelle, which is a wreath or cross or some such emblem made of rosettes of black linen, with sometimes a yellow rosette at the conjunction of the cross's bars, kind of sorrowful breastpin, so to say. The immortelle requires no attention. You just hang it up, and there you are. Just leave it alone. It will take care of your grief for you, and keep it in mind better than you can. Stands weather first rate, and lasts like boiler iron. On sunny days, pretty little chameleons, gracefullest of legged reptiles, creep along the marble fronts of the vaults and catch flies. Their changes of color, as to variety, are not up to the creature's reputation. They change color when a person comes along and hangs up an immortelle, but that is nothing. Any right-feeling reptile would do that. I will gradually drop this subject of graveyards. I have been trying all I could to get down to the sentimental part of it, but I cannot accomplish it. I think there is no genuinely sentimental part to it. It is all grotesque, ghastly, horrible. Graveyards may have been justifiable in the bygone ages, when nobody knew that for every dead body put into the ground to glut the earth and the plant roots and the air with disease germs, 5 or 50 or maybe 100 persons must die before their proper time. But they are hardly justifiable now, when even the children know that a dead saint enters upon a century-long career of assassination the moment the earth closes over his corpse. It is a grim sort of a thought. The relics of St. Anne, up in Canada, have now, after 1900 years, gone to curing the sick by the dozen. But it is merest matter of course that these same relics, within a generation after St. Anne's death and burial, made several thousand people sick. Therefore these miracle performances are simply compensation, nothing more. St. Anne is somewhat slow pay for a saint, it is true, but better a debt paid, after 1900 years, and outlawed by the statute of limitations, than not paid at all, and most of the knights of the halo do not pay at all. Where you find one that pays, like St. Anne, you find 150 that take the benefit of the statute, and none of them pay any more than the principal of what they owe. They pay none of the interest, either simple or compound. A saint can never quite return the principal, however, for his dead body kills people, whereas his relics heal only. They never restore the dead to life. That part of the account is always left unsettled. Dr. F. Julius Lemoyne, after 50 years of medical practice, wrote, "The inhumation of human bodies, dead from infectious diseases, results in constantly loading the atmosphere and polluting the waters with not only the germs that rise from simply putrefaction, but also with the specific germs of the diseases from which death resulted. The gases from buried corpses will rise to the surface through 8 or 10 feet of gravel just as coal gas will do, and there is practically no limit to their power of escape. During the epidemic in New Orleans in 1853, Dr. E. H. Barton reported that in the 4th District the mortality was 452 per thousand, more than double that of any other. In this district were 3 large cemeteries, in which during the previous year more than 3,000 bodies had been buried. In other districts the proximity of cemeteries seemed to aggravate the disease. In 1828, Professor Bianchi demonstrated how the fearful reappearance of the plague at Modena was caused by excavations in ground where, 300 years previously, the victims of the pestilence had been buried. Mr. Cooper, in explaining the causes of some epidemics, remarks that the opening of the plague burial grounds at Ayam resulted in an immediate outbreak of disease. North American Review, No. 3, Volume 135. In an address before the Chicago Medical Society, in advocacy of cremation, Dr. Charles W. Purdy made some striking comparisons to show what a burden is laid upon society by the burial of the dead. 1 1/4 times more money is expended annually in funerals in the United States than the government expends for public school purposes. Funerals cost this country in 1880 enough money to pay the liabilities of all the commercial failures in the United States during the same year, and give each bankrupt a capital of $8,630 with which to resume business. Funerals cost annually more money than the value of the combined gold and silver yield of the United States in the year 1880. These figures do not include the sums invested in burial grounds and expended in tombs and monuments, nor the loss from depreciation of property in the vicinity of the cemeteries. For the rich, cremation would answer as well as burial, for the ceremonies connected with it could be made as costly and ostentatious as a Hindu suttee. While for the poor, cremation would be better than burial, because so cheap. Footnote, $4 or $5 is the minimum cost. So cheap until the poor got to imitating the rich, which they would do by and by. The adoption of cremation would relieve us of a muck of threadbare burial witticisms, but on the other hand it would resurrect a lot of mildewed old cremation jokes that have had a rest for 2,000 years. I have a colored acquaintance who earns his living by odd jobs and heavy manual labor. He never earns above $400 in a year, and as he has a wife and several young children, the closest scrimping is necessary to get him through to the end of the 12 months debtless. To such a man a funeral is a colossal financial disaster. While I was writing one of the preceding chapters, this man lost a little child. He walked the town over with a friend, trying to find a coffin that was within his means. He bought the very cheapest one he could find, plain wood, stained. It cost him $26. It would have cost less than $4, probably, if it had been built to put something useful into it. He and his family will feel that outlay a good many months. Chapter 43. The Art of Inhumation. About the same time I encountered a man in the street whom I had not seen for 6 or 7 years, and something like this talk followed. I said, "But you used to look sad and oldish. You don't now. Where did you get all this youth and bubbling cheerfulness? Give me the address." He chuckled blithely, took off his shining tile, pointed to a notched pink circlet of paper pasted into its crown, with something lettered on it, and went on chuckling while I read, J.B. Undertaker. Then he clapped his hat on, gave it an irreverent tilt to leeward, and cried out, "That's what's the matter. It used to be rough times with me when you knew me. Insurance agency business, you know. Mighty irregular. Big fire, all right. Brisk trade for 10 days while people scared. After that, dull policy business till next fire. Town like this don't have fires often enough. A fellow strikes so many dull weeks in a row that he gets discouraged. But you bet you this is the business. People don't wait for examples to die. No, sir, they drop off right along. There ain't any dull spots in the undertaker line. I just started in with 2 or 3 little old coffins and a hired hearse, and now look at the thing. I've worked up a business here that would satisfy any man, don't care who he is. 5 years ago, lodged in an attic. Live in a swell house now with a mansard roof and all of the modern inconveniences. Does a coffin pay so well? Is there much profit on a coffin? Go away, how you talk! Then, with a confidential wink, a dropping of the voice, and an impressive laying of his hand on my arm, look here, there's one thing in this world which isn't ever cheap. That's a coffin. There's one thing in this world which a person don't ever try to Jew you down. That's a coffin. There's one thing in this world which a person don't say, "I'll look around a little, and if I find I can't do better, I'll come back and take it." That's a coffin. There's one thing in this world which a person won't take in pine if he can go walnut, and won't take in walnut if he can go mahogany, and won't take in mahogany if he can go an iron casket with silver door plate and bronze handles. That's a coffin. And there's one thing in this world which you don't have to worry around after a person to get him to pay for. And that's a coffin. Undertaking? Why, it's the dead surest business in Christendom, and the nobbiest. Why, just look at it. A rich man won't have anything but your very best. And you can just pile it on, too. Pile it on and sock it to him. He won't even holler. And you take in a poor man, and if you work him right, he'll bust himself on a single layout, or especially a woman. For instance, Mrs. O'Flaherty comes in, widow, wiping her eyes and kind of moaning, unhandkerchiefs one eye, bats it around tearfully over the stock, and says, "And what might ye ask for that one?" $39, madam," says I. "It's a fine big price, sure, but Pat shall be buried like a gentleman, as he was, if I have to work me fingers off for it. I'll have that one, sir." "Yes, madam," says I, "and it is a very good one, too. Not costly, to be sure, but in this life we must cut our garments to our clothes, as the saying is." And as she starts out, I heave in, kind of casually, "This one with the white satin lining is a beauty, but I am afraid, well, $65 is a rather, but no matter. I felt obliged to say to Mrs. O'Shaughnessy, 'D'ye mind to say that Bridget O'Shaughnessy bought the mite to that Joel box to ship that drunken divil to purgatory in?' 'Yes, madam.' 'Then Pat shall go to heaven in the twin to it, if it takes the last rap the O'Flahertys can raise. And mind you, stick on some extras, too, and I'll give you another $1. And as I lay in with the livery stables, of course I don't forget to mention that Mrs. O'Shaughnessy hired $54 worth of hacks, and flung as much style into Dennis's funeral as if he had been a duke or an assassin. And of course she sails in and goes the O'Shaughnessy about 4 hacks and an omnibus better. That used to be, but that's all played now, that is, in this particular town. The Irish got to piling up hacks so on their funerals that a funeral left them ragged and hungry for 2 years afterward, so the priest pitched in and broke it all up. He don't allow them to have but 2 hacks now, and sometimes only 1. "Well," I said, "if you are so light-hearted and jolly in ordinary times, what must you be in an epidemic?" He shook his head. "No, you're off, there. We don't like to see an epidemic. An epidemic don't pay. Well, of course I don't mean that exactly, but it don't pay in proportion to the regular thing. Don't it occur to you why?" "No." "Think." "I can't imagine. What is it?" "It's just 2 things." "Well, what are they?" "One's embalming." "And what's the other?" "Ice." "How is that?" "Well,
In ordinary times, a person dies and we lay him up in ice, 1 day, 2 days, maybe 3, to wait for friends to come. Takes a lot of it, melts fast. We charge jewelry rates for that ice, and war prices for attendance. Well, don't you know, when there's an epidemic, they rush 'em to the cemetery the minute the breath's out. No market for ice in an epidemic. Same with embalming. You take a family that's able to embalm, and you've got a soft thing. You can mention 16 different ways to do it, though there ain't only 1 or 2 ways, when you come down to the bottom facts of it. And they'll take the highest priced way every time. It's human nature. Human nature in grief. It don't reason, you see. Time being, it don't care a damn. All it wants is physical immortality for deceased, and they're willing to pay for it. All you've got to do is to just be calm and stack it up. They'll stand the racket. Why, man, you can take a defunct that you couldn't give away and get your embalming traps around you and go to work, and in a couple of hours he is worth a cool $600. That's what he's worth. There ain't anything equal to it but trading rats for diamonds in time of famine. Well, don't you see, when there's an epidemic, people don't wait to embalm. No, indeed they don't. And it hurts the business like hell. As we say, hurts it like hell. Health, see? Our little joke in the trade. Well, I must be going. Give me a call whenever you need any. When you're going by sometime. In his joyful high spirits, he did the exaggerating himself, if any has been done. I have not enlarged on him. With the above brief reference to inhumation, let us leave the subject. As for me, I hope to be cremated. I made that remark to my pastor once, who said, with what he seemed to think was an impressive manner, "I wouldn't worry about that if I had your chances." Much he knew about it, the family all so opposed to it. Chapter 44. City Sights. The old French part of New Orleans, anciently the Spanish part, bears no resemblance to the American end of the city, the American end which lies beyond the intervening brick business center. The houses are massed in blocks, are austerely plain and dignified, uniform of pattern, with here and there a departure from it with pleasant effect. All are plastered on the outside, and nearly all have long iron-railed verandas running along the several stories. Their chief beauty is the deep, warm, varicolored stain with which time and the weather have enriched the plaster. It harmonizes with all the surroundings, and has as natural a look of belonging there as has the flush upon sunset clouds. This charming decoration cannot be successfully imitated, neither is it to be found elsewhere in America. The iron railings are a specialty also. The pattern is often exceedingly light and dainty, and airy and graceful, with a large cipher or monogram in the center, a delicate cobweb of baffling, intricate forms wrought in steel. The ancient railings are handmade, and are now comparatively rare and proportionately valuable. They are become bric-a-brac. The party had the privilege of idling through this ancient quarter of New Orleans with the South's finest literary genius, the author of the Grandissimes. In him the South has found a masterly delineator of its interior life and its history. In truth, I find by experience that the untrained eye and vacant mind can inspect it, and learn of it, and judge of it, more clearly and profitably in his books than by personal contact with it. With Mr. Cable along to see for you, and describe and explain and illuminate a jog through that old quarter is a vivid pleasure, and you have a vivid sense as of unseen or dimly seen things, vivid and yet fitful and darkling. You glimpse salient features, but lose the fine shades or catch them imperfectly through the vision of the imagination. A case, as it were, of ignorant near-sighted stranger traversing the rim of wide vague horizons of Alps with an inspired and enlightened long-sighted native. We visited the old St. Louis Hotel, now occupied by municipal offices. There is nothing strikingly remarkable about it, but one can say of it, as of the Academy of Music in New York, that if a broom or a shovel has ever been used in it, there is no circumstantial evidence to back up the fact. It is curious that cabbages and hay and things do not grow in the Academy of Music, but no doubt it is on account of the interruption of the light by the benches, and the impossibility of hoeing the crop except in the aisles. The fact that the ushers grow their buttonhole bouquets on the premises shows what might be done if they had the right kind of agricultural head of the establishment. We visited also the venerable cathedral, and the pretty square in front of it, the one dim with religious light, the other brilliant with the worldly sort, and lovely with orange trees and blossomy shrubs. Then we drove in the hot sun through the wilderness of houses, and out on to the wide dead level beyond, where the villas are, and the water wheels to drain the town, and the commons populous with cows and children, passing by an old cemetery where we were told lie the ashes of an early pirate, but we took him on trust, and did not visit him. He was a pirate with a tremendous and sanguinary history, and as long as he preserved unspotted, in retirement, the dignity of his name and the grandeur of his ancient calling, homage and reverence were his from high and low. But when at last he descended into politics and became a paltry alderman, the public shook him, and turned aside and wept. When he died, they set up a monument over him, and little by little he has come into respect again. But it is respect for the pirate, not the alderman. Today the loyal and generous remember only what he was, and charitably forget what he became. Thence we drove a few miles across a swamp, along a raised shell road, with a canal on one hand and a dense wood on the other, and here and there in the distance a ragged and angular-limbed and moss-bearded cypress, top standing out, clear-cut against the sky, and as quaint of form as the apple trees in Japanese pictures. Such was our course, and the surroundings of it. There was an occasional alligator swimming comfortably along in the canal, and an occasional picturesque colored person on the bank, flinging his statue-rigid reflection upon the still water, and watching for a bite. And by we reached the West End, a collection of hotels of the usual light summer resort pattern, with broad verandas all around, and the waves of the wide and blue Lake Pontchartrain lapping the thresholds. We had dinner on a ground veranda over the water, the chief dish, the renowned fish called the pompano, delicious as the less criminal forms of sin. Thousands of people come by rail and carriage to West End and to Spanish Fort every evening, and dine, listen to the bands, take strolls in the open air under the electric lights, go sailing on the lake, and entertain themselves in various and sundry other ways. We had opportunities on other days and in other places to test the pompano, notably at an editorial dinner at one of the clubs in the city. He was in his last possible perfection there, and justified his fame. In his suite was a tall pyramid of scarlet crayfish, large ones, as large as one's thumb, delicate, palatable, appetizing. Also deviled whitebait, also shrimps of choice quality, and a platter of small soft-shell crabs of a most superior breed. The other dishes were what one might get at Delmonico's or Buckingham Palace. Those I have spoken of can be had in similar perfection in New Orleans only, I suppose. In the West and South they have a new institution, the Broom Brigade. It is composed of young ladies who dress in a uniform costume and go through the infantry drill with broom in place of musket. It is a very pretty sight on private view. When they perform on the stage of a theater, in the blaze of colored fires, it must be a fine and fascinating spectacle. I saw them go through their complex manual with grace, spirit, and admirable precision. I saw them do everything which a human being can possibly do with a broom, except sweep. I did not see them sweep, but I know they could learn. What they have already learned proves that. And if they ever should learn, and go on the warpath down Chupitulas or some of the other streets around there, those thoroughfares would bear a greatly improved aspect in a very few minutes, but the girls themselves wouldn't, so nothing would be really gained after all. The drill was in the Washington Artillery Building. In this building we saw many interesting relics of the war. Also, a fine oil painting representing Stonewall Jackson's last interview with General Lee. Both men are on horseback. Jackson has just ridden up and is accosting Lee. The picture is very valuable on account of the portraits, which are authentic. But, like many another historical picture, it means nothing without its label, and one label will fit it as well as another. First interview between Lee and Jackson. Last interview between Lee and Jackson. Jackson introducing himself to Lee. Jackson accepting Lee's invitation to dinner. Jackson declining Lee's invitation to dinner with thanks. Jackson apologizing for a heavy defeat. Jackson reporting a great victory. Jackson asking Lee for a match. It tells one story, and a sufficient one, for it says quite plainly and satisfactorily, here are Lee and Jackson together. The artist would have made it tell that this is Lee and Jackson's last interview, if he could have done it, but he couldn't, for there wasn't any way to do it. A good legible label is usually worth for information a ton of significant attitude and expression in a historical picture. In Rome, people with fine sympathetic natures stand up and weep in front of the celebrated Beatrice Cenci the day before her execution. It shows what a label can do. If they did not know the picture, they would inspect it unmoved and say, "Young girl with hay fever," "Young girl with her head in a bag." I found the half-forgotten Southern intonations and elisions as pleasing to my ear as they had formerly been. A Southerner talks music. At least it is music to me, but then I was born in the South. The educated Southerner has no use for an R, except at the beginning of a word. He says "onna" and "dinna" and "govna" and "before the war," and so on. The words may lack charm to the eye, in print, but they have it to the ear. When did the R disappear from Southern speech, and how did it come to disappear? The custom of dropping it was not borrowed from the North, nor inherited from England. Many Southerners, most Southerners, put a Y into occasional words that begin with the K sound. For instance, they say, "Mr. Kyata," Carter, and speak of playing kyads, or of riding in the kyas, and they have the pleasant custom, long ago fallen into decay in the North, of frequently employing the respectful "sir." Instead of the curt "yes" and the abrupt "no," they say "yes, sir," "no, sir." But there are some infelicities, such as "like" for "as," and the addition of an "at" where it isn't needed. I heard an educated gentleman say, "like the flag officer did." His cook or his butler would have said, "like the flag officer done." You hear gentlemen say, "where have you been at?" And here is the aggravated form. Heard a ragged street Arab say it to a comrade, "I was a-asking Tom what you was a-setting at." The very elect carelessly say "will" when they mean "shall," and many of them say, "I didn't go to do it," meaning, "I didn't mean to do it." The northern word "guess," imported from England, where it used to be common, and now regarded by satirical Englishmen as a Yankee original, is but little used among Southerners. They say "reckon." They haven't any "doesn't" in their language. They say "don't" instead. The unpolished often use "went" for gone. It is nearly as bad as the northern "hadn't ought." This reminds me that a remark of a very peculiar nature was made here in my neighborhood, in the North, a few days ago. "He hadn't ought to have went." How is that? Isn't that a good deal of a triumph? One knows the orders combined in this half-breed's architecture without inquiring. One parent Northern, the other Southern. Today I heard a schoolmistress ask, "Where is John gone?" This form is so common, so nearly universal in fact, that if she had used whither instead of where, I think it would have sounded like an affectation. We picked up one excellent word, a word worth traveling to New Orleans to get, a nice, limber, expressive, handy word, lagniappe. They pronounce it Lanny Yap. It is Spanish, so they said. We discovered it at the head of a column of odds and ends in the Picayune, the first day. Heard 20 people use it the second. Inquired what it meant the third. Adopted it, and got facility in swinging it in the fourth. It has a restricted meaning, but I think the people spread it out a little when they choose. It is the equivalent of the 13th roll in a baker's dozen. It is something thrown in, gratis, for good measure. The custom originated in the Spanish quarter of the city, when a child or a servant buys something in a shop, or even the mayor or the governor, for aught I know. He finishes the operation by saying, "Give me something for lagniappe." The shopman always responds, gives the child a bit of licorice root, gives the servant a cheap cigar or a spool of thread, gives the governor, I don't know what he gives the governor, support, likely. When you are invited to drink, and this does occur now and then in New Orleans, and you say, "What, again? No, I've had enough," the other party says, "But just this one time more. This is for lagniappe." When the beau perceives that he is stacking his compliments a trifle too high, and sees by the young lady's countenance that the edifice would have been better with the top compliment left off, he puts his "I beg pardon, no harm intended," into the briefer form of "Oh, that's for lagniappe." If the waiter in the restaurant stumbles and spills a gill of coffee down the back of your neck, he says, "For lagniappe, sir," and gets you another cup without extra charge. Chapter 45. Southern Sports. In the North, one hears the war mentioned in social conversation once a month, sometimes as often as once a week. But as a distinct subject for talk, it has long ago been relieved of duty. There are sufficient reasons for this. Given a dinner company of 6 gentlemen today, it can easily happen that 4 of them, and possibly 5, were not in the field at all. So the chances are 4-2, or 5-1, that the war will at no time during the evening become the topic of conversation, and the chances are still greater that if it become the topic, it will remain so but a little while. If you add 6 ladies to the company, you have added 6 people who saw so little of the dread realities of the war that they ran out of talk concerning them years ago, and now would soon weary of the war topic if you brought it up. The case is very different in the South. There every man you meet was in the war, and every lady you meet saw the war. The war is the great chief topic of conversation. The interest in it is vivid and constant. The interest in other topics is fleeting. Mention of the war will wake up a dull company and set their tongues going, when nearly any other topic would fail. In the South, the war is what A.D. is elsewhere. They date from it. All day long you hear things placed as having happened since the war, or during the war, or before the war, or right after the war, or about 2 years, or 5 years, or 10 years before the war, or after the war. It shows how intimately every individual was visited in his own person by that tremendous episode. It gives the inexperienced stranger a better idea of what a vast and comprehensive calamity invasion is than he can ever get by reading books at the fireside. At a club one evening, a gentleman turned to me and said in an aside, "You notice, of course, that we are nearly always talking about the war. It isn't because we haven't anything else to talk about, but because nothing else has so strong an interest for us. And there is another reason. In the war, each of us, in his own person, seems to have sampled all the different varieties of human experience. As a consequence, you can't mention an outside matter of any sort, but it will certainly remind some listener of something that happened during the war, and out he comes with it. Of course, that brings the talk back to the war. You may try all you want to keep other subjects before the house, and we may all join in and help, But there can be but one result. The most random topic would load every man up with war reminiscences, and shut him up, too. And talk would be likely to stop presently, because you can't talk pale inconsequentialities when you've got a crimson fact or fancy in your head that you are burning to fetch out. The poet was sitting some little distance away, and presently he began to speak about the moon. The gentleman who had been talking to me remarked in an aside, "There, the moon is far enough from the seat of war, but you will see that it will suggest something to somebody about the war. In 10 minutes from now the moon, as a topic, will be shelved." The poet was saying he had noticed something which was a surprise to him, had the impression that down here toward the equator the moonlight was much stronger and brighter than up north, had the impression that when he visited New Orleans many years ago, the moon interruption from the other end of the room. "Let me explain that. Reminds me of an anecdote. Everything has changed since the war, for better or for worse. But you'll find people down here born grumblers, who see no change except the change for the worse. There was an old Negro woman of this sort. A young New Yorker said in her presence, 'What a wonderful moon you have down here.' She sighed and said, 'Ah, bless your heart, honey, you ought to seen that moon before the war.'" The new topic was dead already, but the poet resurrected it and gave it a new start. A brief dispute followed as to whether the difference between northern and southern moonlight really existed or was only imagined. Moonlight talk drifted easily into talk about artificial methods of dispelling darkness. Then somebody remembered that when Farragut advanced upon Port Hudson on a dark night, and did not wish to assist the aim of the Confederate gunners, he carried no battle lanterns, but painted the decks of his ship white, and thus created a dim but valuable light, which enabled his own men to grope their way around with considerable facility. At this point the war got the floor again, the 10 minutes not quite up yet. I was not sorry, for war talk by men who have been in a war is always interesting, whereas moon talk by a poet who has not been in the moon is likely to be dull. We went to a cockpit in New Orleans on a Saturday afternoon. I had never seen a cockfight before. There were men and boys there of all ages and all colors, and of many languages and nationalities. But I noticed one quite conspicuous and surprising absence: the traditional brutal faces. There were no brutal faces. With no cockfighting going on, you could have played the gathering on a stranger for a prayer meeting, and after it began, for a revival, provided you blindfolded your stranger, for the shouting was something prodigious. A Negro and a white man were in the ring, everybody else outside. The cocks were brought in sacks, and when time was called, they were taken out by the two bottle holders, stroked, caressed, poked toward each other, and finally liberated. The big black cock plunged instantly at the little gray one, and struck him on the head with his spur. The gray responded with spirit. Then the babel of many-tongued shoutings broke out, and ceased not thenceforth. When the cocks had been fighting some little time, I was expecting them momently to drop dead, for both were blind, red with blood, and so exhausted that they frequently fell down. Yet they would not give up, neither would they die. The Negro and the white man would pick them up every few seconds, wipe them off, blow cold water on them in a fine spray, and take their heads in their mouths, and hold them there a moment, to warm back the perishing life, perhaps, I do not know. Then, being set down again, the dying creatures would totter gropingly about, with dragging wings, find each other, strike a guesswork blow or two, and fall exhausted once more. I did not see the end of the battle. I forced myself to endure it as long as I could, but it was too pitiful a sight, so I made frank confession to that effect, and we retired. We heard afterward that the black cock died in the ring, and fighting to the last. Evidently there is abundant fascination about this sport for such as have had a degree of familiarity with it. I never saw people enjoy anything more than this gathering enjoyed this fight. The case was the same with old gray heads and with boys of 10. They lost themselves in frenzies of delight. The cocking mane is an inhuman sort of entertainment, there is no question about that. Still, it seems a much more respectable and far less cruel sport than fox hunting, for the cocks like it. They experience as well as confer enjoyment, which is not the fox's case. We assisted, in the French sense, at a mule race one day. I believe I enjoyed this contest more than any other mule there. I enjoyed it more than I remember having enjoyed any other animal race I ever saw. The grandstand was well filled with the beauty and the chivalry of New Orleans. That phrase is not original with me. It is the Southern reporter's. He has used it for 2 generations. He uses it 20 times a day, or 20,000 times a day, or 1,000,000 times a day, according to the exigencies. He is obliged to use it 1,000,000 times a day if he have occasion to speak of respectable men and women that often, for he has no other phrase for such service except that single one. He never tires of it. It always has a fine sound to him. There is a kind of swell medieval bulliness and tinsel about it that pleases his gaudy barbaric soul. If he had been in Palestine in the early times, we should have had no references to much people out of him. No, he would have said, "The beauty and the chivalry of Galilee assembled to hear the Sermon on the Mount." It is likely that the men and women of the South are sick enough of that phrase by this time, and would like a change, but there is no immediate prospect of their getting it. The New Orleans editor has a strong, compact, direct, unflowery style, wastes no words, and does not gush. Not so with his average correspondent. In the appendix I have quoted a good letter, penned by a trained hand, but the average correspondent hurls a style which differs from that. For instance, the Times Democrat sent a relief steamer up one of the bayous last April. This steamer landed at a village up there somewhere, and the captain invited some of the ladies of the village to make a short trip with him. They accepted and came aboard. The steamboat shoved out up the creek. That was all there was to it. And that is all that the editor of the Times Democrat would have got out of it. There was nothing in the thing but statistics, and he would have got nothing else out of it. He would probably have even tabulated them, partly to secure perfect clearness of statement, and partly to save space. But his special correspondent knows other methods of handling statistics. He just throws off all restraint and wallows in them. On Saturday, early in the morning, the beauty of the place graced our cabin, and proud of her fair freight, the gallant little boat glided up the bayou. 22 words to say the ladies came aboard, and the boat shoved out up the creek, is a clean waste of 10 good words, and is also destructive of compactness of statement. The trouble with the Southern reporter is women. They unsettle him. They throw him off his balance. He is plain and sensible and satisfactory until a woman heaves in sight. Then he goes all to pieces. His mind totters. He becomes flowery and idiotic. From reading the above extract, you would imagine that this student of Sir Walter Scott is an apprentice and knows next to nothing about handling a pen. On the contrary, he furnishes plenty of proofs, in his long letter, that he knows well enough how to handle it when the women are not around to give him the artificial flower complaint. For instance, at 4 o'clock ominous clouds began to gather in the southeast, and presently from the Gulf there came a blow which increased in severity every moment. It was not safe to leave the landing then, and there was a delay. The oaks shook off long tresses of their mossy beards to the tugging of the wind, and the bayou in its ambition put on miniature waves in mocking of much larger bodies of water. A lull permitted a start, and homewards we steamed, an inky sky overhead and a heavy wind blowing. As darkness crept on, there were few on board who did not wish themselves nearer home. There is nothing wrong with that. It is good description, compactly put. Yet there was great temptation there to drop into lurid writing. But let us return to the mule. Since I left him, I have rummaged around and found a full report of the race. In it I find confirmation of the theory which I broached just now, namely, that the trouble with the Southern reporter is women. Women supplemented by Walter Scott and his knights and beauty and chivalry and so on. This is an excellent report, as long as the women stay out of it. But when they intrude, we have this frantic result. It will be probably a long time before the ladies' stand presents such a sea of foam-like loveliness as it did yesterday. The New Orleans women are always charming, but never so much so as at this time of the year, when in their dainty spring costumes they bring with them a breath of balmy freshness and an odor of sanctity unspeakable. The stand was so crowded with them that, walking at their feet and seeing no possibility of approach, many a man appreciated as he never did before the Perry's feeling at the gates of paradise, and wondered what was the priceless boon that would admit him to their sacred presence. Sparkling on their white-robed breasts or shoulders were the colors of their favorite knights, and were it not for the fact that the doughy heroes appeared on unromantic mules, it would have been easy to imagine one of King Arthur's gala days. There were 13 mules in the first heat. All sorts of mules they were, all sorts of complexions, gaits, dispositions, aspects. Some were handsome creatures, some were not. Some were sleek, some hadn't had their fur brushed lately. Some were innocently gay and frisky. Some were full of malice and all unrighteousness. Guessing from looks, some of them thought the matter on hand was war, some thought it was a lark. The rest took it for a religious occasion, and each mule acted according to his convictions. The result was an absence of harmony well compensated by a conspicuous presence of variety of a picturesque and entertaining sort. All the riders were young gentlemen in fashionable society. If the reader has been wondering why it is that the ladies of New Orleans attend so humble an orgy as a mule race, the thing is explained now. It is a fashion freak. All connected with it are people of fashion. It is great fun and cordially liked. The mule race is one of the marked occasions of the year. It has brought some pretty fast mules to the front. One of these had to be ruled out because he was so fast that he turned the thing into a one-mule contest and robbed it of one of its best features, variety. But every now and then somebody disguises him with a new name and a new complexion and rings him in again. The riders dress in full jockey costumes of bright-colored silks, satins, and velvets. The 13 mules got away in a body after a couple of false starts and scampered off with prodigious spirit. As each mule and each rider had a distinct opinion of his own as to how the race ought to be run, and which side of the track was best in certain circumstances, and how often the track ought to be crossed, and when a collision ought to be accomplished, and when it ought to be avoided, these 26 conflicting opinions created a most fantastic and picturesque confusion, and the resulting spectacle was killingly comical. Mile heat, time 2 minutes 22 seconds. 8 of the 13 mules distanced. I had a bet on a mule which would have won if the procession had been reversed. The second heat was good fun, and so was the consolation race for beaten mules, which followed later, but the first heat was the best in that respect. I think that much the most enjoyable of all races is a steamboat race, but next to that I prefer the gay and joyous mule rush. 2 red-hot steamboats raging along neck and neck, straining every nerve, that is to say every rivet in the boilers, quaking and shaking and groaning from stem to stern, spouting white steam from the pipes, pouring black smoke from the chimneys, raining down sparks, parting the river into long breaks of hissing foam. This is sport that makes a body's very liver curl with enjoyment. A horse race is pretty tame and colorless in comparison. Still, a horse race might be well enough in its way, perhaps, if it were not for the tiresome false starts. But then nobody is ever killed. At least, nobody was ever killed when I was at a horse race. They have been crippled, it is true, but this is little to the purpose. Chapter 46. Enchantments and Enchanters. The largest annual event in New Orleans is a something which we arrive too late to sample, the Mardi Gras festivities. I saw the procession of the mystic crew of Comus there 24 years ago, with knights and nobles and so on, clothed in silken and golden Paris-made gorgeousnesses, planned and bought for that single night's use, and in their train all manner of giants, dwarfs, monstrosities, and other diverting grotesquerie, a startling and wonderful sort of show, as it filed solemnly and silently down the street in the light of its smoking and flickering torches. But it is said that in these latter days the spectacle is mightily augmented, as to cost, splendor, and variety. There is a chief personage, Rex, and if I remember rightly, neither this king nor any of his great following of subordinates is known to any outsider. All these people are gentlemen of position and consequence, and it is a proud thing to belong to the organization. So the mystery in which they hide their personality is merely for romance's sake, and not on account of the police. Mardi Gras is of course a relic of the French and Spanish occupation, but I judge that the religious feature has been pretty well knocked out of it now. Sir Walter has got the advantage of the gentleman of the cowl and rosary, and he will stay. His medieval business, supplemented by the monsters and the oddities and the pleasant creatures from fairyland, is finer to look at than the poor fantastic inventions and performances of the reveling rabble of the priest's day, and serves quite as well, perhaps, to emphasize the day and admonish men that the grace line between the worldly season and the holy one is reached. This Mardi Gras pageant was the exclusive possession of New Orleans until recently, but now it has spread to Memphis and St. Louis and Baltimore. It has probably reached its limit. It is a thing which could hardly exist in the practical North, would certainly last but a very brief time, as brief a time as it would last in London, for the soul of it is the romantic, not the funny and the grotesque. Take away the romantic mysteries, the kings and knights and big-sounding titles, and Mardi Gras would die, down there in the South. The very feature that keeps it alive in the South, girly romance, would kill it in the North or in London. Puck and Punch and the press universal would fall upon it and make merciless fun of it, and its first exhibition would be also its last. Against the crimes of the French Revolution and of Bonaparte may be set two compensating benefactions. The Revolution broke the chains of the Ancien Regime and of the Church, and made of a nation of abject slaves a nation of free men. And Bonaparte instituted the setting of merit above birth, and also so completely stripped the divinity from royalty that whereas crowned heads in Europe were gods before, they are only men since, and can never be gods again, but only figureheads, and answerable for their acts like common clay. Such benefactions as these compensate the temporary harm which Bonaparte and the Revolution did, and leave the world in debt to them for these great and permanent services to liberty, humanity, and progress. Then comes Sir Walter Scott, with his enchantments, and by his single might checks this wave of progress, and even turns it back, sets the world in love with dreams and phantoms, with decayed and swinish forms of religion, with decayed and degraded systems of government, with the silliness and emptiness, sham grandeurs, sham gauds, and sham chivalries of a brainless and worthless long-vanished society. He did measureless harm, more real and lasting harm, perhaps, than any other individual that ever wrote. Most of the world has now outlived good part of these harms, though by no means all of them, but in our South they flourish pretty forcefully still. Not so forcefully as half a generation ago, perhaps, but still forcefully. There the genuine and wholesome civilization of the 19th century is curiously confused and commingled with the Walter Scott middle-aged sham civilization. And so you have practical, common-sense, progressive ideas, and progressive works, mixed up with the duel, the inflated speech, and the jejune romanticism of an absurd past that is dead, and out of charity ought to be buried. But for the Sir Walter Scott disease, the character of the Southerner, or Southron, according to Sir Walter's starchier way of phrasing it, would be wholly modern, in place of modern and medieval mixed, and the South would be fully a generation further advanced than it is. It was Sir Walter that made every gentleman in the South a major or a colonel, or a general or a judge, before the war, and it was he also that made these gentlemen value these bogus decorations. For it was he that created rank and caste down there, and also reverence for rank and caste, and pride and pleasure in them. Enough is laid on slavery, without fathering upon it these creations and contributions of Sir Walter. Sir Walter had so large a hand in making Southern character, as it existed before the war, that he is in great measure responsible for the war. It seems a little harsh toward a dead man to say that we never should have had any war but for Sir Walter, and yet something of a plausible argument might perhaps be made in support of that wild proposition. The Southerner of the American Revolution owned slaves, so did the Southerner of the Civil War, but the former resembles the latter as an Englishman resembles a Frenchman. The change of character can be traced rather more easily to Sir Walter's influence than to that of any other thing or person. One may observe, by one or two signs, how deeply that influence penetrated, and how strongly it holds. If one take up a Northern or Southern literary periodical of 40 or 50 years ago, he will find it filled with wordy, windy, flowery eloquence, romanticism, sentimentality, all imitated from Sir Walter, and sufficiently badly done, too, innocent travesties of his style and methods, in fact. This sort of literature being the fashion in both sections of the country, there was opportunity for the fairest competition, and, as a consequence, the South was able to show as many well-known literary names, proportioned to population, as the North could. But a change has come, and there is no opportunity now for a fair competition between North and South, for the North has thrown out that old inflated style, whereas the Southern writer still clings to it, and has a restricted market for his wares as a consequence. There is as much literary talent in the South now as ever there was, of course, but its work can gain but slight currency under present conditions. The authors write for the past, not the present. They use obsolete forms and a dead language. But when a Southerner of genius writes modern English, his book goes upon crutches no longer, but upon wings, and they carry it swiftly all about America and England, and through the great English reprint publishing houses of Germany, as witness the experience of Mr. Cable and Uncle Remus, two of the very few Southern authors who do not write in the Southern style. Instead of 3 or 4 widely known literary names, the South ought to have a dozen or two, and will have them when Sir Walter's time is out. A curious exemplification of the power of a single book for good or harm is shown in the effects wrought by Don Quixote and those wrought by Ivanhoe. The first swept the world's admiration for the medieval chivalry silliness out of existence, and the other restored it. As far as our South is concerned, the good work done by Cervantes is pretty nearly a dead letter, so effectually has Scott's pernicious work undermined it. Chapter 47. Uncle Remus and Mr. Cable. Mr. Joel Chandler Harris, Uncle Remus, was to arrive from Atlanta at 7 o'clock Sunday morning, so we got up and received him. We were able to detect him among the crowd of arrivals at the hotel counter by his correspondence with a description of him which had been furnished us from a trustworthy source. He was said to be undersized, red-haired, and somewhat freckled. He was the only man in the party whose outside tallied with this bill of particulars. He was said to be very shy. He is a shy man. Of this there is no doubt. It may not show on the surface, but the shyness is there. After days of intimacy, one wonders to see that it is still in about as strong force as ever. There is a fine and beautiful nature hidden behind it, as all know who have read the Uncle Remus book, and a fine genius, too, as all know by the same sign. I seem to be talking quite freely about this neighbor, but in talking to the public I am but talking to his personal friends, and these things are permissible among friends. He deeply disappointed a number of children who had flocked eagerly to see Mr. Cable's house to get a glimpse of the illustrious sage and oracle of the nation's nurseries. They said, "Why, he's white!" They were grieved about it. So, to console them, the book was brought, that they might hear Uncle Remus's tar-baby story from the lips of Uncle Remus himself, or what in their outraged eyes was left of him. But it turned out that he had never read aloud to people, and was too shy to venture the attempt now. Mr. Cable and I read from books of ours to show him what an easy trick it was. But his immortal shyness was proof against even this sagacious strategy, so we had to read about Brer Rabbit ourselves. Mr. Harris ought to be able to read the Negro dialect better than anybody else, for in the matter of writing it he is the only master the country has produced. Mr. Cable is the only master in the writing of French dialects that the country has produced, and he reads them in perfection. It was a great treat to hear him read about Jean Poquelin and about Inerarity and his famous pig shoe, representing Louisiana refusing to hunter the Union, along with passages of nicely shaded German dialect from a novel which was still in manuscript. It came out in conversation that in two different instances Mr. Cable got into grotesque trouble by using, in his books, next to impossible French names, which nevertheless happened to be borne by living and sensitive citizens of New Orleans. His names were either inventions or were borrowed from the ancient and obsolete past. I do not now remember which, but at any rate living bearers of them turned up, and were a good deal hurt at having attention directed to themselves and their affairs in so excessively public a manner. Mr. Warner and I had an experience of the same sort when we wrote the book called The Gilded Age. There is a character in it called Sellers. I do not remember what his first name in the beginning, but anyway, Mr. Warner did not like it, and wanted it improved. He asked me if I was able to imagine a person named Eschol Sellers. Of course I said I could not, without stimulants. He said that away out west once he had met and contemplated and actually shaken hands with a man bearing that impossible name, Eschol Sellers. He added, "It was 20 years ago. His name has probably carried him off before this, and if it hasn't he will never see the book anyhow. We will confiscate his name. The name you are using is common and therefore dangerous. There are probably 1,000 Sellers bearing it, and the whole horde will come after us. But Eschol Sellers is a safe name. It is a rock." So we borrowed that name, and when the book had been out about a week, one of the stateliest and handsomest and most aristocratic-looking white men that ever lived called around, with the most formidable libel suit in his pocket that ever, well, in brief, we got his permission to suppress an edition of 10 million Footnote, figures taken from memory and probably incorrect. I think it was more. 10 million copies of the book, and change that name to Mulberry Sellers in future editions. Chapter 48. Sugar and Postage. One day on the street I encountered the man whom, of all men, I most wished to see, Horace Bixby, formerly pilot under me, or rather over me, now captain of the great steamer City of Baton Rouge, the latest and swiftest addition to the anchor line. The same slender figure, the same tight curls, the same springy step, the same alertness, the same decision of eye and answering decision of hand, the same erect military bearing. Not an inch gained or lost in girth, not an ounce gained or lost in weight, not a hair turned. It is a curious thing to leave a man 35 years old and come back at the end of 21 years and find him still only 35. I have not had an experience of this kind before, I believe. There were some crow's feet, but they counted for next to nothing, since they were inconspicuous. His boat was just in. I had been waiting several days for her. proposing to return to St. Louis in her. The captain and I joined a party of ladies and gentlemen, guests of Major Wood, and went down the river 54 miles in a swift tug to ex-Governor Warmouth's sugar plantation. Strung along below the city were a number of decayed, ramshackly, superannuated old steamboats, not one of which had I ever seen before. They had all been built and worn out and thrown aside since I was here last. This gives one a realizing sense of the frailness of a Mississippi boat and the briefness of its life. 6 miles below town, a fat and battered brick chimney, sticking above the magnolias and live oaks, was pointed out as the monument erected by an appreciative nation to celebrate the Battle of New Orleans, Jackson's victory over the British, January 8, 1815. The war had ended, the two nations were at peace, but the news had not yet reached New Orleans. If we had had the cable telegraph in those days, this blood would not have been spilt, those lives would not have been wasted, and better still, Jackson would probably never have been president. We have gotten over the harms done us by the War of 1812, but not over some of those done us by Jackson's presidency. The Warmouth plantation covers a vast deal of ground, and the hospitality of the Warmouth mansion is graduated to the same large scale. We saw steam plows at work here for the first time. The traction engine travels about on its own wheels till it reaches the required post. Then it stands still, and by means of a wire rope pulls the huge plow towards itself 200 or 300 yards across the field, between the rows of cane. The thing cuts down into the black mold 1.5 feet deep. The plow looks like a fore and aft brace of a Hudson River steamer inverted. When the Negro steersman sits on one end of it, that end tilts down near the ground, while the other sticks up high in air. This great seesaw goes rolling and pitching like a ship at sea, and it is not every circus rider that could stay on it. The plantation contains 2,600 acres, 650 are in cane, and there is a fruitful orange grove of 5,000 trees. The cane is cultivated after a modern and intricate scientific fashion, too elaborate and complex for me to attempt to describe, but it lost $40,000 last year. I forget the other details. However, this year's crop will reach 10 or 1,200 tons of sugar. Consequently, last year's loss will not matter. These troublesome and expensive scientific methods achieve a yield of 1.5 tons, and from that to 2 tons to the acre, which is 3 or 4 times what the yield of an acre was in my time. The drainage ditches were everywhere alive with little crabs, fiddlers. One saw them scampering sideways in every direction whenever they heard a disturbing noise. Expensive pests, these crabs, for they bore into the levees and ruin them. The great sugar house was a wilderness of tubs and tanks and vats, and filters, pumps, pipes, and machinery. The process of making sugar is exceedingly interesting. First, you heave your cane into the centrifugals and grind out the juice. Then run it through the evaporating pan to extract the fiber. Then through the bone filter to remove the alcohol. Then through the clarifying tanks to discharge the molasses. Then through the granulating pipe to condense it. Then through the vacuum pan to extract the vacuum. It is now ready for market. I have jotted these particulars down from memory. The thing looks simple and easy. Do not deceive yourself. To make sugar is really one of the most difficult things in the world, and to make it right is next to impossible. If you will examine your own supply every now and then for a term of years, and tabulate the result, you will find that not 2 men in 20 can make sugar without getting sand into it. We could have gone down to the mouth of the river and visited Captain Eads' great work, the jetties, where the river has been compressed between walls, and thus deepened to 26 feet. But it was voted useless to go, since at this stage of the water everything would be covered up and invisible. We could have visited that ancient and singular burg, Pilot Town, which stands on stilts in the water, so they say,
where nearly all communication is by skiff and canoe, even to the attending of weddings and funerals, and where the littlest boys and girls are as handy with the oar as unamphibious children are with the velocipede. We could have done a number of other things, but on account of limited time, we went back home. The sail up the breezy and sparkling river was a charming experience, and would have been satisfyingly sentimental and romantic but for the interruptions of the tug's pet parrot, whose tireless comments upon the scenery and the guests were always this worldly and often profane. He had also a superabundance of the discordant, ear-splitting, metallic laugh common to his breed, a machine-made laugh, a Frankenstein laugh, with the soul left out of it. He applied it to every sentimental remark, and to every pathetic song. He cackled it out with hideous energy after home again from a foreign shore, and said he wouldn't give a damn for a tugload of such rot. Romance and sentiment cannot long survive this sort of discouragement, so the singing and talking presently ceased, which so delighted the parrot that he cursed himself hoarse for joy. Then the male members of the party moved to the forecastle to smoke and gossip. There were several old steamboat men along, and I learned from them a great deal of what had been happening to my former river friends during my long absence. I learned that a pilot whom I used to steer for is become a spiritualist, and for more than 15 years has been receiving a letter every week from a deceased relative through a New York spiritualist medium named Manchester. Postage, graduated by distance, from the local post office in Paradise to New York, $5. From New York to St. Louis, 3 cents. I remember Mr. Manchester very well. I called on him once 10 years ago with a couple of friends, one of whom wished to inquire after a deceased uncle. This uncle had lost his life in a peculiarly violent and unusual way half a dozen years before. A cyclone blew him some 3 miles and knocked a tree down with him, which was 4 feet through at the butt and 65 feet high. He did not survive this triumph. At the seance just referred to, my friend questioned his late uncle through Mr. Manchester, and the late uncle wrote down his replies, using Mr. Manchester's hand and pencil for that purpose. The following is a fair example of the question asked, and also of the sloppy twaddle in the way of answers furnished by Manchester under the pretense that it came from the spectre. If this man is not the paltriest fraud that lives, I owe him an apology. Question: where are you? Answer: in the spirit world. Q: are you happy? A: very happy, perfectly happy. Q: how do you amuse yourself? A: conversation with friends and other spirits. Q: what else? A: nothing else. Nothing else is necessary. Q: what do you talk about? A: about how happy we are, and about friends left behind in the earth, and how to influence them for their good. Q: when your friends in the earth all get to the spirit land, what shall you have to talk about then? Nothing but about how happy you all are? No reply. It is explained that spirits will not answer frivolous questions. Q: how is it that spirits that are content to spend an eternity in frivolous employments and accept it as happiness are so fastidious about frivolous questions upon the subject? No reply. Q: would you like to come back? A: no. Q: would you say that under oath? A: yes. Q: what do you eat there? A: we do not eat. Q: what do you drink? A: we do not drink. Q: what do you smoke? A: we do not smoke. Q: what do you read? A: we do not read. Q: do all the good people go to your place? A: yes. Q: you know my present way of life. Can you suggest any additions to it in the way of crime that will reasonably ensure my going to some other place? A: no reply. Q: when did you die? A: I did not die. I passed away. Q: very well, then, when did you pass away? How long have you been in the spirit land? A: we have no measurements of time here.
Q. Though you may be indifferent and uncertain as to dates and times in your present condition and environment, this has nothing to do with your former condition. You had dates then. One of these is what I ask for. You departed on a certain day in a certain year. Is not this true? A. Yes. Q. Then name the day of the month. Much fumbling with pencil on the part of the medium, accompanied by violent spasmodic jerkings of his head and body for some little time. Finally, explanation to the effect that spirits often forget dates, such things being without importance to them. Q. Then this one has actually forgotten the date of its translation to the spirit land? This was granted to be the case. Q. This is very curious. Well, then, what year was it? More fumbling, jerking, idiotic spasms on the part of the medium. Finally, explanation to the effect that the spirit has forgotten the year. Q. This is indeed stupendous. Let me put one last question to you, before we part to meet no more. For even if I fail to avoid your asylum, a meeting there will go for nothing as a meeting, since by that time you will easily have forgotten me and my name. Did you die a natural death, or were you cut off by a catastrophe? A. After long hesitation and many throes and spasms, natural death. This ended the interview. My friend told the medium that when his relative was in this poor world, he was endowed with an extraordinary intellect and an absolutely defectless memory, and it seemed a great pity that he had not been allowed to keep some shred of these for his amusement in the realms of everlasting contentment, and for the amazement and admiration of the rest of the population there. This man had plenty of clients, has plenty yet. He receives letters from spirits located in every part of the spirit world, and delivers them all over this country through the United States mail. These letters are filled with advice from spirits who don't know as much as a tadpole, and this advice is religiously followed by the receivers. One of these clients was a man whom the spirits, if one may thus plurally describe the ingenious Manchester, were teaching how to contrive an improved railway car wheel. It is coarse employment for a spirit, but it is higher and wholesomer activity than talking forever about how happy we are. Chapter 49. Episodes in Pilot Life. In the course of the tugboat gossip, it came out that out of every 5 of my former friends who had quitted the river, 4 had chosen farming as an occupation. Of course, this was not because they were peculiarly gifted agriculturally, and thus more likely to succeed as farmers than in other industries. The reason for their choice must be traced to some other source. Doubtless they chose farming because that life is private and secluded from irruptions of undesirable strangers, like the pilot-house hermitage. And doubtless they also chose it because on 1,000 nights of black storm and danger they had noted the twinkling lights of solitary farmhouses as the boat swung by, and pictured to themselves the serenity and security and coziness of such refuges at such times, and so had by and by come to dream of that retired and peaceful life as the one desirable thing to long for, anticipate, earn, and at last enjoy. But I did not learn that any of these pilot farmers had astonished anybody with their successes. Their farms do not support them. They support their farms. The pilot farmer disappears from the river annually about the breaking of spring, and is seen no more till next frost. Then he appears again in damaged homespun, combs the hayseed out of his hair, and takes a pilot-house berth for the winter. In this way he pays the debts which his farming has achieved during the agricultural season. So his river bondage is but half broken. He is still the river's slave the hardest half of the year. One of these men bought a farm, but did not retire to it. He knew a trick worth 2 of that. He did not propose to pauperize his farm by applying his personal ignorance to working it.
No, he put the farm into the hands of an agricultural expert to be worked on shares. Out of every 3 loads of corn, the expert to have 2, and the pilot the third. But at the end of the season the pilot received no corn. The expert explained that his share was not reached. The farm produced only 2 loads. Some of the pilots whom I had known had had adventures. The outcome fortunate sometimes, but not in all cases. Captain Montgomery, whom I had steered for when he was a pilot, commanded the Confederate fleet in the great battle before Memphis. When his vessel went down, he swam ashore, fought his way through a squad of soldiers, and made a gallant and narrow escape. He was always a cool man. Nothing could disturb his serenity. Once, when he was captain of the Crescent City, I was bringing the boat into port at New Orleans, and momently expecting orders from the hurricane deck, but received none. I had stopped the wheels, and there my authority and responsibility ceased. It was evening, dim twilight, the captain's hat was perched upon the big bell, and I supposed the intellectual end of the captain was in it. But such was not the case. The captain was very strict. Therefore I knew better than to touch a bell without orders. My duty was to hold the boat steadily on her calamitous course, and leave the consequences to take care of themselves, which I did. So we went plowing past the sterns of steamboats and getting closer and closer. The crash was bound to come very soon, and still that hat never budged, for, alas, the captain was napping in the Texas. Things were becoming exceedingly nervous and uncomfortable. It seemed to me that the captain was not going to appear in time to see the entertainment, but he did. Just as we were walking into the stern of a steamboat, he stepped out on deck and said with heavenly serenity, "Set her back on both," which I did, but a trifle late, however, for the next moment we went smashing through that other boat's flimsy outer works with a most prodigious racket. The captain never said a word to me about the matter afterwards, except to remark that I had done right, and that he hoped I would not hesitate to act in the same way again in like circumstances. One of the pilots whom I had known when I was on the river had died a very honorable death. His boat caught fire, and he remained at the wheel until he got her safe to land. Then he went out over the breastboard with his clothing in flames, and was the last person to get ashore. He died from his injuries in the course of 2 or 3 hours, and his was the only life lost. The history of Mississippi piloting affords 6 or 7 instances of this sort of martyrdom, and half a hundred instances of escapes from a like fate, which came within a second or 2 of being fatally too late. But there are no instances of a pilot deserting his post to save his life, while by remaining and sacrificing it he might secure other lives from destruction. It is well worth while to set down this noble fact, and well worth while to put it in italics, too. The cub pilot is early admonished to despise all perils connected with a pilot's calling, and to prefer any sort of death to the deep dishonor of deserting his post while there is any possibility of his being useful in it. And so effectively are these admonitions inculcated that even young and but half-tried pilots can be depended upon to stick to the wheel and die there when occasion requires. In a Memphis graveyard is buried a young fellow who perished at the wheel a great many years ago in White River to save the lives of other men. He said to the captain that if the fire would give him time to reach a sandbar some distance away, all could be saved, but that to land against the bluff bank of the river would be to insure the loss of many lives. He reached the bar and grounded the boat in shallow water, but by that time the flames had closed around him, and in escaping through them he was fatally burned. He had been urged to fly sooner, but had replied, as became a pilot to reply, "I will not go. If I go, nobody will be saved. If I stay, no one will be lost but me. I will stay." There were 200 persons on board, and no life was lost but the pilot's. There used to be a monument to this young fellow in that Memphis graveyard. While we tarried in Memphis on our down trip, I started out to look for it, but our time was so brief that I was obliged to turn back before my object was accomplished. The tugboat gossip informed me that Dick Kenner was dead, blown up near Memphis and killed; that several others whom I had known had fallen in the war, one or two of them shot down at the wheel; that another and very particular friend, whom I had steered many trips for, had stepped out of his house in New Orleans one night years ago to collect some money in a remote part of the city, and had never been seen again; was murdered and thrown into the river, it was thought; that Ben Thornburg was dead long ago, also his wild cub, whom I used to quarrel with all through every daylight watch. A heedless, reckless creature he was, and always in hot water, always in mischief. An Arkansas passenger brought an enormous bear aboard one day, and chained him to a lifeboat on the hurricane deck. Thornburg's cub could not rest till he had gone there and unchained the bear to see what he would do. He was promptly gratified. The bear chased him around and around the deck for miles and miles, with 200 eager faces grinning through the railings for audience, and finally snatched off the lad's coat tail and went into the Texas to chew it. The off-watch turned out with alacrity, and left the bear in sole possession. He presently grew lonesome, and started out for recreation. He ranged the whole boat, visited every part of it, with an advance guard of fleeing people in front of him, and a voiceless vacancy behind him; and when his owner captured him at last, those two were the only visible beings anywhere. Everybody else was in hiding, and the boat was a solitude. I was told that one of my pilot friends fell dead at the wheel from heart disease in 1869. The captain was on the roof at the time. He saw the boat breaking for the shore, shouted, and got no answer; ran up, and found the pilot lying dead on the floor. Mr. Bixby had been blown up in Madrid Bend, was not injured, but the other pilot was lost. George Ritchie had been blown up near Memphis, blown into the river from the wheel, and disabled. The water was very cold. He clung to a cotton bale, mainly with his teeth, and floated until nearly exhausted. When he was rescued by some deck hands who were on a piece of the wreck, they tore open the bale and packed him in the cotton, warmed the life back into him, and got him safe to Memphis. He is one of Bixby's pilots on the Baton Rouge now. Into the life of a steamboat clerk, now dead, had dropped a bit of romance, somewhat grotesque romance, but romance nevertheless. When I knew him, he was a shiftless young spendthrift, boisterous, good-hearted, full of careless generosities, and pretty conspicuously promising to fool his possibilities away early and come to nothing. In a western city lived a rich and childless old foreigner and his wife, and in their family was a comely young girl, sort of friend, sort of servant. The young clerk of whom I have been speaking, whose name was not George Johnson, but who shall be called George Johnson for the purposes of this narrative, got acquainted with this young girl, and they sinned, and the old foreigner found them out and rebuked them. Being ashamed, they lied, and said they were married, that they had been privately married. Then the old foreigner's hurt was healed, and he forgave and blessed them. After that they were able to continue their sin without concealment. By and by the foreigner's wife died, and presently he followed after her. Friends of the family assembled to mourn, and among the mourners sat the two young sinners. The will was opened and solemnly read. It bequeathed every penny of that old man's great wealth to Mrs. George Johnson. And there was no such person. The young sinners fled forth then, and did a very foolish thing: married themselves before an obscure justice of the peace, and got him to antedate the thing. That did no sort of good. The distant relatives flocked in, and exposed the fraudful date with extreme suddenness and surprising ease, and carried off the fortune, leaving the Johnsons very legitimately and legally and irrevocably chained together in honorable marriage, but with not so much as a penny to bless themselves withal. Such are the actual facts, and not all novels have for a base so telling a situation.